I suspected my wife was secretly planning a bad divorce, so I moved my assets entirely out of her reach. 3 weeks later, she filed a devastating lawsuit against me and then desperately backtracked when her ultimate plan spectacularly backfired. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever outsmarted someone who underestimated you. My name is Hollis Granger, and I am exactly 69 years old. I built a commercial empire with my bare hands, but the hardest battle of my life started right in my own kitchen. The morning sun glared through the bay windows as I sat calmly at the breakfast table. Yvonne left her iPad unlocked on the Marble Island counter while she went to the pantry. A calendar notification flashed brightly across the screen. I leaned closer to read the bold text. Strategy meeting, Bradley Family Law Asset Division Draft. The cruel words hit my chest with the heavy force of a sledgehammer. Yvonne rushed back into the kitchen. Her eyes widened in absolute panic. She snatched the tablet off the counter and pressed it defensively against her chest. She lied directly to my face without missing a single beat. She claimed it was just a regular alert for a local charity committee meeting. I did not raise my voice or demand an explanation. I simply took a slow sip of my bitter black coffee. I nodded at her fabricated excuse and picked up my keys. I walked out the front door into the crisp air. My profound silence was not a surrender to her deceit. It was the immediate initiation of a highly calculated silent war she had absolutely no idea she had just ruthlessly started this very morning. I climbed into the driver's seat of my 10-year-old truck and turned the heavy key in the ignition. I could easily afford a fleet of exotic sports cars, but this reliable truck kept me completely grounded in reality. I drove down the bustling interstate highway toward my corporate headquarters. I parked my vehicle directly in front of the massive primary warehouse and turned off the loud diesel engine. I sat there in absolute silence for several long minutes. I stared at the towering steel building bearing my last name in bold blue letters. 40 hard years ago, I started this massive logistics company with nothing but a single rusted toolbox and an old, unreliable van. I sacrificed my youth sweating on dirty loading docks and inhaling harsh exhaust fumes every single day. I absolutely refused to let a deceitful, greedy spouse steal a black man's lifetime of brutal physical labor through some cowardly court documents. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked with immense purpose and burning focus through the busy glass double doors of the main lobby. The receptionist smiled and tried to hand me my daily schedule, but I completely ignored her. I walked straight into my private corner office and aggressively slammed the heavy oak door securely shut right behind me. I immediately bypassed all my scheduled morning meetings. I picked up my secure desk phone and dialed a private unlisted number. I called my chief forensic accountant, Simon. He had worked diligently for me for nearly 2 decades investigating corporate theft and neutralizing severe financial liabilities. I ordered him to cancel everything on his current agenda and come straight to my office immediately. I told him we had a massive internal financial emergency that required his absolute, complete, and total professional discretion today. Simon arrived 20 minutes later carrying a heavy briefcase filled with highly encrypted digital financial ledgers. We sat across from each other at my large conference table and began a meticulous line-by-line audit. We did not have to search for very long before we uncovered the devastating truth. We discovered a massive bleeding wound hidden deep within my personal joint bank accounts. Yvonne had systematically siphoned exactly $300,000 over the past 8 consecutive months. She secretly funneled all that cash directly into a completely unknown offshore shell company registered in the Caribbean. She intentionally disguised her theft by labeling every single illicit transfer as a fictitious philanthropic donation to various obscure local charities. Her incredibly deceptive accounting tactics were undeniably brilliant, but fundamentally flawed against a seasoned professional like Simon. We traced every stolen dollar right back to an aggressive legal retainer fund controlled by her newly hired divorce attorney. She was actively hoarding a massive legal war chest solely designed to completely bleed me dry in family court. She intended to drag out the upcoming litigation process until I was completely financially paralyzed and forced to accept an extremely unfavorable settlement agreement. My blood burned hot in my veins, but I forcefully maintained my stoic composure. Anger is a remarkably useless emotion when you are currently facing a ruthless financial predator. You do not yell at a thief who is already standing inside your house holding your money. You quietly and methodically lock all the doors so they can never possibly escape. I looked directly at Simon across the long table and told him to immediately close the bright laptop screen right now. I had already seen absolutely enough concrete evidence to completely confirm my absolute worst fears about the deceptive woman I married. I slowly stood up and walked over to my large, dry erase calendar mounted securely on the white office wall. I began to calculate my exact available timeline with absolute precision. Based on the stolen funds and the meeting scheduled with her lawyer, her ultimate goal was painfully obvious to me. Yvonne intended to file for divorce exactly at the highly anticipated 40th anniversary gala for my logistics company. She desperately wanted to execute her devastating ambush perfectly in front of 500 powerful industry leaders and prominent politicians. Her twisted objective was to publicly humiliate me into a state of total emotional paralysis. She firmly believed that exposing my private marital failure in front of my respected professional peers would quickly force a massive panic settlement. She was betting my fragile male ego would surrender millions of dollars just to swiftly bury the horrible public embarrassment today. She severely misjudged my entire character. I had exactly 3 short weeks before the prestigious anniversary corporate gala took place. 3 weeks to completely dismantle her entire financial safety net before she even realized she was currently standing on a totally crumbling foundation. I turned back towards Simon, who was still waiting silently for my command. I instructed him to immediately initiate the absolute most aggressive financial restructuring legally possible under current federal corporate law. I told him to gather my elite team of private trust attorneys right now. We were going to systematically drain the massive joint marital estate of every single available liquid asset. I was not going to play defense against an entitled traitor living comfortably inside my own home. I was going to legally erase my entire net worth before she could ever forcefully touch a single stolen dime. The countdown to her absolute financial destruction began immediately. I walked into the steel and glass boardroom of my corporate legal firm precisely at 8 in the morning. My lead attorney and his team of specialized financial litigators already had the heavy binders laid out across the long mahogany table. I instructed them to immediately begin drafting the ironclad framework for an irrevocable trust. I spent 40 years turning copper wire and sheet metal into a commercial HVAC empire across the entire eastern seaboard. I built my fortune sweating inside commercial ventilation shafts while my peers worked comfortable desk jobs. I was not about to hand half of my life over to a woman who viewed my blue-collar roots with utter disdain. I picked up the heavy brass fountain pen and began signing my name to the stack of transfer documents. I legally moved 95% of my corporate shares directly into the newly established irrevocable trust. I did not hesitate as I pushed my personal real estate portfolio and all liquid investment accounts across the same impenetrable legal threshold. I systematically stripped myself of all personal ownership with every deliberate stroke of the pen. The lawyers watched in silence as I transferred the commercial warehouses, the fleet of service trucks, and the suburban estate Yvonne currently treated like her own personal castle. The physical weight of the paperwork matched the heavy realization of what I was doing. I was intentionally dismantling my own financial identity to protect my legacy from a hostile domestic takeover. I handed the final signed document back to the lead attorney. He stamped the official seal on the thick stack of papers. The transfer was officially complete and legally binding under strict federal law. I walked out of the boardroom a completely different man on paper than the one who had entered. I sat alone in my vehicle and carefully reviewed the final structure of the legal agreement. I had officially appointed myself solely as the managing director of the trust. I controlled every single corporate decision and operational maneuver, but I personally owned absolutely nothing. On paper, Hollis Granger was now merely a salaried employee collecting a standard weekly paycheck with zero personal net worth. The massive marital estate was instantaneously drained of its immense wealth. Yvonne had spent the last 8 months secretly scheming to take exactly half of a $10 million fortune. She had blindly assumed my lifetime of hard work would effortlessly fund her lavish lifestyle and her hidden offshore bank accounts. She was completely unaware that the very foundation of her extravagant, comfortable existence had just been legally vaporized. The company profits, the extensive real estate holdings, and the highly lucrative vendor contracts were now securely locked behind an impenetrable legal fortress. The irrevocable trust was completely immune to standard divorce proceedings or aggressive asset division mandates. Family court judges possess absolutely zero legal jurisdiction to divide assets that do not directly belong to the individual standing before them in court. The law is a cold and precise instrument when utilized properly. I had effectively severed the primary financial lifeline Yvonne relied upon to fund her deceit. The joint bank accounts we shared no longer held the millions she eagerly anticipated claiming today. They were merely hollow shells waiting to be audited. My phone buzzed with an incoming message from Simon confirming the offshore transfers were fully documented for the upcoming trial. I smiled as I started the heavy diesel engine of my truck. I was not simply reacting to my wife's brutal betrayal. I was actively engineering her total financial collapse with cold, calculated precision. I immediately executed the second vital phase of my trap upon returning to my corporate office. 3 short years ago, Yvonne eagerly wanted to renovate the suburban estate to impress her superficial social circle. I told her the renovations required additional corporate liquidity. She blindly signed a comprehensive blanket guarantor form for commercial business loans without reading a single paragraph. She trusted me completely while she obsessively shopped for extremely expensive Italian marble countertops. I utilized that forgotten legal signature today. I contacted my senior commercial banking executive to secure a massive $4 million business loan. I leveraged the entire remaining joint marital estate as absolute collateral for the sudden cash infusion. The bank rapidly processed the extensive application because my logistics company possessed an impeccable financial history. The loan officer required no additional confirmation from Yvonne because her notarized signature was already securely filed in their corporate system. She was legally bound to the massive debt by her own careless hand. She viewed the massive logistics company as an endless fountain of cash designed to effortlessly finance her luxury habits. She never bothered to understand the complex legal mechanisms that actively generated our immense wealth. I sat at my mahogany desk and watched the digital confirmation appear on my secure computer screen. $4 million instantly materialized in the primary joint account we currently shared. To an untrained observer's eye, our marital estate looked incredibly wealthy today. However, this money was entirely borrowed. It was a staggering financial liability, meticulously disguised as sudden liquid cash. Every single dollar carried heavy corporate interest. Yvonne thought she was brilliantly positioning herself to steal half of my lifetime achievements. She had absolutely no idea she was currently standing directly beneath a massive descending financial guillotine I had personally built for her. I did not leave the borrowed $4 million resting in the vulnerable joint account for more than 60 seconds. I immediately executed a secondary wire transfer using my secure administrative terminal. I funneled the entire $4 million loan directly into the untouchable, irrevocable trust. I officially categorized the massive transfer as a strategic operational business investment for future logistics infrastructure expansion. The digital transaction fully cleared the banking network instantaneously. The joint marital estate now held absolutely zero liquid cash today. It held exactly $4 million in active, legally binding commercial debt. I successfully transformed our shared financial portfolio into a highly radioactive black hole. When Yvonne's ruthless divorce attorney officially filed the inevitable legal paperwork, he would aggressively demand exactly half of the remaining marital assets. The court would grant his aggressive request without hesitation. Yvonne would legally inherit exactly 50% of a massive commercial liability she could never possibly repay. Her stolen war chest of $300,000 would be completely annihilated by the staggering loan interest alone. I logged out of the banking portal and closed my heavy laptop. The intricate financial trap was perfectly set and securely locked. Yvonne thought she was manipulating a tired, uneducated old man who was too exhausted to fight back. She failed to comprehend that I spent 4 brutal decades outsmarting ruthless corporate competitors to build my massive empire. I built my fortune by always anticipating the incoming threat and striking precisely when my enemies felt the most secure. I stared out the office window at the bustling warehouse yard below. The heavy diesel trucks rolled out to complete their daily deliveries. The logistics machinery operated flawlessly under my command. My deceitful wife was about to experience the absolute worst delivery of her entire pathetic life. The heavy oak door of my office swung open without a single knock. Devin walked in with his hands shoved deep into his designer pockets. Courtney marched right behind him. She dropped her expensive leather handbag onto my mahogany desk with a loud, incredibly disrespectful thud. I looked up from my shipping manifests. I did not offer a greeting. Courtney immediately launched into a shrill complaint about the neighborhood they lived in and the domestic vehicle she currently drove. She paced across my office, glaring at the framed photographs of my early days on the loading docks. She sneered at the picture of me holding a wrench with grease on my face. She said they could not possibly maintain their elite social image while driving a vehicle meant for common laborers. She used words like ghetto and urban to describe the reliable truck I bought them last year. She essentially called my entire life of hard work an embarrassment to her refined sensibilities. She told me I needed to realize we were no longer struggling folks from the wrong side of the tracks. She demanded a direct wire transfer of exactly $200,000 to purchase a brand new imported sports car by the end of the week. She crossed her arms and stared at me, expecting me to immediately write a check just to silence her constant whining. I looked at the young white woman standing in the center of the empire I built with my own blood and sweat. She viewed my history of manual labor as a stain on her fabricated prestige. She wanted the heavy fruits of my grueling labor without ever respecting the roots of the tree. I took a slow breath and folded my hands together perfectly on the wooden desk right now. Devin sat back in one of the plush leather chairs across from me and casually checked his extremely expensive watch. He let his wife completely insult his own father without raising a single objection at all. He acted entirely entitled to the massive wealth I bled for decades to accumulate. He genuinely believed that the logistics empire I built simply manifested out of thin air to properly fund his incredibly lavish lifestyle. I stared directly at my son. I felt absolutely no anger or betrayal in this particular moment. I only felt a cold and clinical detachment. The boy I raised to understand the true value of $1 had completely vanished. He was replaced by a soft man who allowed an arrogant woman to demand cash from the very hands that fed him his entire life. I did not argue with either of them today. I simply smiled and nodded my head in absolute agreement. I told Courtney her request was completely reasonable and I would gladly fund the luxury car purchase immediately. The sheer shock on her face was almost comical to witness. She had fully expected a massive argument. Instead, she received total compliance. Devin finally smiled and leaned forward eagerly to ask exactly how quickly the funds would be fully available in their bank account. I told them the cash transfer would be authorized today, but we had to satisfy strict corporate accounting rules first. I calmly opened the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden desk and pulled out a freshly printed legal document. I laid the crisp white papers perfectly flat on the smooth mahogany surface between us. I grabbed a solid gold pen and tapped it lightly against the very bottom signature line, waiting for them to eagerly take the bait completely right now. I handed them the heavy promissory note and pointed directly to the required signature fields at the bottom of the page. I casually stated that signing this internal company document was just a very simple procedural formality for the federal tax authorities. I explained that shifting such a massive amount of corporate liquidity required basic tracking to easily avoid unnecessary audits from the government. I spoke with a reassuring and entirely dismissive tone designed to lower their defensive instincts. The crisp white document resting before them was actually a heavily structured and completely ironclad loan agreement. My corporate lawyers had drafted the extremely predatory contract specifically for this exact moment. It explicitly established a binding financial lien using Devin and Courtney's massive suburban home as absolute collateral for the $200,000 cash transfer. They were currently so completely blinded by their uncontrollable greed that they did not even bother to read a single word of the dense fine print. Their eyes were entirely fixated on the massive influx of free money they believed they were about to receive today. They simply viewed me as a foolish and compliant old man surrendering to their superior demands. They failed to realize that every single word printed on that paper was a meticulously crafted legal weapon designed to entirely destroy their future security. If they defaulted on the repayment terms listed in the contract, I possessed the absolute legal right to aggressively seize their property and evict them immediately. I watched them closely as they eagerly leaned over the large wooden desk. They never questioned why a self-made millionaire would simply hand over a massive fortune without establishing any binding conditions. Their staggering arrogance made executing this ruthless financial trap incredibly effortless and completely flawless for me to accomplish today. Courtney eagerly grabbed the gold pen and quickly signed her name across the bottom line with an incredibly smug smile. She practically shoved the document toward her husband without a second thought. Devin took the pen and signed immediately after her. He offered me a condescending nod of approval as if he were rewarding a disobedient child who had finally learned to behave properly. They stood up and immediately began loudly bragging about the specific interior trim they planned to order for their shiny new imported car. They turned their backs on me and happily walked out of the spacious office without expressing a single word of genuine gratitude. They confidently returned to their comfortable lives, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality they had just willingly signed into existence today. They did not realize the expensive suburban house they just carelessly leveraged was legally tied directly to the rapidly crumbling joint marital estate Yvonne was aggressively trying to divide. When the impending divorce officially dismantled the family finances, the collateral clause in this very contract would immediately activate to cover the missing liquidity. I waited patiently until the heavy oak door clicked securely shut behind them. I picked up the signed promissory note and carefully reviewed their matching signatures. I walked over to the reinforced steel safe hidden behind a large portrait on the wall. I inputted the complex security code and placed the lethal document securely inside. I locked the heavy vault door and spun the metal dial to scramble the combination. The second phase of my intricate financial retaliation was now officially armed and permanently locked in place. I returned to my desk and calmly took another long sip of my black coffee. The merciless consequences of their immense arrogance were rapidly approaching them without any warning today. The grand ballroom of the downtown Plaza Hotel glowed beneath 3 massive crystal chandeliers. 500 prominent industry leaders gathered to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Granger Commercial HVAC. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the wealthy crowd carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. Flashbulbs popped incessantly near the main entrance as the local business press documented the arrival of the city's elite. Yvonne glided through the center of the room wearing a breathtaking custom silk gown, the intricate emerald fabric draped perfectly across her shoulders. She purchased that exact dress using the $300,000 she secretly siphoned from our joint marital accounts over the past 8 months. She smiled radiantly at the cameras and linked her arm affectionately through mine. She played the role of the devoted and deeply loving wife with absolute flawless precision. She introduced me to visiting politicians and corporate executives while softly patting my chest to project an image of unbreakable domestic bliss. I walked beside her, completely aware of the venomous deception masking her beautiful features. I shook hands with my oldest competitors and accepted their warm congratulations on 4 decades of uninterrupted commercial dominance. I built this entire empire by connecting sheet metal in freezing warehouses while Yvonne slept comfortably in a very warm bed. She now paraded around this lavish room, fully believing she was mere moments away from stealing half of my life legacy. She leaned intimately toward my ear and whispered how incredibly proud she was of my massive success. I looked directly into her eyes and thanked her for her unwavering honesty. I felt absolutely no sadness as I watched her enjoy the luxurious spotlight. The orchestra finished their classical introduction, and the Master of Ceremonies formally called for the room to take their assigned seats now. The Master of Ceremonies invited me to the elevated stage to deliver my highly anticipated keynote speech. I buttoned my tailored suit jacket and walked confidently up the carpeted stairs. I stood behind the polished wooden podium and looked out across the vast sea of expectant faces. The room quieted down as I prepared to recount the brutal physical struggles that birthed this massive corporation. Before I could speak a single word into the microphone, the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom violently swung open. The sudden loud crash echoed sharply across the quiet room. Attorney Bradley marched down the center aisle with heavy, aggressive steps. He wore an expensive gray suit and a completely arrogant smirk designed to intimidate. The 500 wealthy guests turned in their chairs to watch the bizarre interruption. Bradley did not pause to acknowledge the intense audience confusion. He walked straight past the front row tables where my corporate board members sat in stunned silence. He climbed the stage stairs without an ounce of hesitation. He marched directly up to the wooden podium and slammed a thick stack of legal divorce documents right in front of the active microphone. The loud thud resonated instantly through the massive ballroom speakers. The entire room fell completely dead silent. You could easily hear a tiny pin drop on the carpeted floor. Bradley puffed out his chest and served me the hostile litigation papers in front of every single industry leader I respected. He fully intended to strip away my fundamental dignity and falsely portray me as a weak, defeated old man, caught entirely off guard by his brilliant legal maneuver. He arrogantly stared at me with extreme predatory confidence, eagerly anticipating my total emotional collapse before this very enormous and quiet crowd watching tonight. Yvonne instantly unleashed her meticulously rehearsed theatrical performance for the mesmerized audience. She stood up abruptly from her front row seat and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at me. She loudly accused me of severe financial abuse and relentless emotional cruelty over the long span of our 40-year marriage. She projected her voice expertly, ensuring her completely fabricated tears and dramatic sobs reached the very back of the massive ballroom tonight. She claimed I treated her like a helpless prisoner while hoarding the vast corporate wealth she supposedly helped me build from the ground up. The 500 wealthy guests murmured in collective shock as she expertly painted herself as a tragically oppressed domestic victim. Attorney Bradley grabbed the active microphone on the wooden podium. His voice boomed through the speakers with absolute aggressive authority. He publicly announced a devastating emergency court order designed to immediately freeze all of my corporate and personal assets. He loudly proclaimed that my personal bank accounts, real estate holdings, and commercial properties were now completely locked by a powerful family court judge. He detailed exactly how he was forcefully halting all company operations to permanently prevent me from illegally hiding my immense wealth from his extremely vulnerable client. They had carefully coordinated this spectacular ambush to maximize my public humiliation. Yvonne and Bradley stood together on the stage, completely convinced they had trapped me in an inescapable corner. They firmly expected me to fall to my knees and cry out loud to beg for mercy to save my beloved reputation today. They desperately wanted me to violently explode in a massive fit of rage to instantly validate Yvonne's vicious claims of emotional abuse. They waited eagerly for my total public destruction to successfully unfold right before their very greedy eyes here tonight. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I calmly reached up and adjusted the knot of my silk tie with steady hands. I looked down at the towering stack of hostile litigation documents resting aggressively on my podium. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for my inevitable meltdown. I slowly picked up the heavy legal papers and tucked them neatly under my left arm. I turned my head and looked directly into Yvonne's expecting eyes. Her fake tears instantly stopped flowing as she realized I was not completely shattering under her massive public pressure. I offered her a remarkably gentle and incredibly warm smile that deeply unsettled her. I leaned directly into the active microphone so my final words would echo loudly through the enormous ballroom. I sincerely wished her the absolute best of luck in her wonderfully independent future endeavors. I told her I truly hoped she found the extraordinary wealth and profound happiness she was desperately seeking tonight. I stepped away from the podium and calmly walked down the carpeted stairs without looking back a single time. I walked straight past Bradley, who stood frozen on the stage in absolute utter disbelief. He had meticulously engineered this brutal theatrical ambush, expecting a wildly defensive opponent. My chilling, totally emotionless reaction severely unnerved both Yvonne and her very aggressive lawyer today. They suddenly realized they had not trapped a frightened old man in a desperate corner. They had merely executed a completely useless performance against a fearless ghost. My impenetrable silence sent a terrifying warning straight down their spines. They firmly believed they had decisively won the opening battle of this highly bitter divorce. They had absolutely no idea they were already completely bankrupt and walking straight into my lethal trap. The mandatory mediation session began the following Tuesday morning inside a towering glass high-rise downtown. I walked into the expansive conference room wearing a simple charcoal suit. Simon walked quietly beside me, holding only a single thin briefcase. We sat on one side of the massive mahogany table. Yvonne sat directly across from me. She wore an expensive white designer suit purchased with my stolen money. She projected the absolute confidence of a woman who fully believed she had already won the war. Attorney Bradley sat right next to her. He immediately dominated the physical space in the room. He unpacked dozens of thick legal binders and spread them aggressively across the polished wood. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers together with an incredibly condescending posture. He spoke to me as if I were a completely defeated man, cornered by a vastly superior legal mind. He detailed how my public silence at the gala proved I had absolutely no viable defense against his aggressive litigation strategy. He claimed he had completely locked down my financial networks with the emergency court order. He told me I was entirely at his mercy today. He arrogantly suggested I surrender quickly to avoid a lengthy and painfully public trial. Yvonne sat back in her plush leather chair and offered me a highly victorious smirk. She genuinely believed her meticulous trap had triggered perfectly. She thought the lifetime of brutal physical labor I spent building my commercial HVAC empire was about to be officially signed over to her today. I did not interrupt Bradley during his aggressive opening monologue. I simply folded my hands on the table and let him exhaust his arrogant energy. I waited patiently for the inevitable moment their fragile illusion of absolute control would violently shatter into pieces forever. Yvonne pushed her chair forward and took total control of the ongoing negotiation. She placed a typed list of unyielding demands directly in the center of the wooden table. She forcefully demanded sole ownership of our sprawling suburban estate. She insisted I legally surrender exactly 50% of my corporate shares in the commercial HVAC company I built from nothing. She then demanded a mandatory and permanent spousal support payment of $40,000 every single month. She claimed this exorbitant amount was strictly necessary to maintain the elite lifestyle she had grown accustomed to over the past decade. Finally, she looked me directly in the eyes with cold and absolute malice. She demanded I completely vacate the primary property by midnight tonight. She stated she had already hired private security contractors to forcibly remove my belongings if I dared to remain on the premises. She spoke with a venomous entitlement that erased 40 years of shared history in less than 2 minutes. She genuinely viewed me as a disposable machine that had outlived its usefulness and simply needed to be dismantled for parts today. Bradley nodded in firm agreement with every single word she spoke. He tapped his expensive pen against his legal pad to emphasize the absolute finality of their demands. He proudly informed me that any refusal to comply would result in immediate and incredibly aggressive courtroom litigation. They presented their terms as an unavoidable surrender agreement rather than a standard legal negotiation. They heavily relied on the emergency court order to leverage my complete compliance. I maintained my perfectly neutral expression while she finished listing her financial requirements. I did not exhibit a single trace of anger or visible frustration. I simply turned my head and looked directly at Simon sitting quietly beside me right now. Simon functioned as my primary legal representative for this mandatory session. He remained absolutely silent and completely motionless until Yvonne fully concluded her aggressive list of extreme demands. He did not bother to unpack any massive legal binders or display any heavy briefcases to counter Bradley. He simply reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He withdrew a single incredibly thin manila folder. He placed it precisely on the polished wood. He used his index finger to slowly slide the extremely light document across the mahogany table directly toward Bradley. Simon cleared his throat and spoke with an impeccably calm and calculated professional tone. He formally announced to the active mediator that this specific folder contained the official legally binding declaration of the joint marital estate. He explicitly stated that these certified pages represented the absolute totality of my current net worth. Bradley let out a highly dismissive chuckle as he looked down at the incredibly thin file resting before him. He clearly expected a massive corporate portfolio containing thousands of complex financial spreadsheets detailing 40 years of immense commercial growth. He fully anticipated fighting a long battle to aggressively audit a vastly wealthy domestic empire. Yvonne leaned forward in her plush chair with greedy anticipation radiating from her entirely confident posture. She firmly believed those few pages held the definitive legal surrender of my massive logistics company today. She expected to see her guaranteed 50% ownership clearly validated right there in black and white ink. Simon crossed his arms and quietly urged the arrogant attorney to open the certified document immediately. I sat perfectly still, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute precision. The massive financial trap I methodically constructed over the past 3 weeks was now officially triggered in this very room right here and right now today. Bradley flipped open the thin manila folder with an incredibly exaggerated motion. He scanned the first certified page outlining the verified marital assets. His deeply arrogant smile instantly vanished from his pale face. He aggressively flipped to the second page, searching for the vast commercial wealth he confidently expected to easily divide today. He found absolutely nothing. The official marital estate contained 0 corporate shares. It completely lacked any personal real estate holdings or massive liquid investment portfolios. Bradley stared down at the official documents in absolute stunned silence. He read the painfully short list of active assets aloud to the completely bewildered mediator. The entire joint marital estate officially held exactly one 10-year-old domestic truck. The remainder of the certified ledger outlined a staggeringly massive financial liability. The joint estate held exactly $4 million in highly aggressive commercial business debt. Bradley quickly wiped a sudden bead of cold sweat from his deeply wrinkled forehead. He frantically turned the pages, looking for any hidden offshore accounts or secret trust funds he could legally target. There was absolutely nothing left for him to forcefully seize. The immense fortune Yvonne had desperately plotted to steal for the past 8 months was entirely gone. It had legally vanished without leaving a single actionable trace behind. Bradley slowly looked up from the paperwork and stared directly at Simon. He finally realized he had walked blindly into a meticulously engineered execution chamber. He was no longer a powerful predator cornering a wealthy victim. He was a completely defeated man standing inside an empty vault holding a massive bomb. Yvonne sat beside him, completely unaware of the terrifying reality currently printed in front of them. The absolute financial destruction she brought upon herself was fully documented right here for them both today, forever. Yvonne aggressively snatches the thin manila folder directly out of Bradley's paralyzed hands. She flips through the sparse pages with frantic and uncontrolled movements. The crisp paper crinkles loudly in the suffocating silence of the mediation room. She looks for the massive real estate portfolios and corporate stock ledgers she firmly believed were rightfully hers. She finds nothing but the vehicle title for my 10-year-old truck and the massive commercial liability documents. Her manicured nails dig into the table as her face contorts into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She turns her vicious glare toward the neutral mediator sitting at the head of the table. She screams that the documents are completely fabricated. She loudly accuses me of illegally funneling my massive corporate fortune into secret offshore bank accounts. She demands an immediate and highly invasive forensic audit of my entire logistics empire. She insists the mediator order federal investigators to tear through my company ledgers to uncover the hidden millions. She slams her fist against the polished mahogany surface to emphasize her furious demands. She points directly at my face and calls me a criminal who is actively attempting to defraud the family court system. She refuses to accept that the staggering wealth she plotted to steal for the past 8 months has completely vanished without a trace. Her shrill voice echoes off the glass walls of the high-rise office as she desperately struggles to regain control of the shattered negotiation. I remain completely motionless in my leather chair. I watch her public meltdown with absolute clinical detachment. Her explosive accusations are completely useless against the flawless legal trap I carefully constructed. I do not offer a single word of defense. I simply let her completely exhaust all her remaining arrogant energy right here today. Simon reaches calmly into his tailored suit jacket and retrieves a second pristine document file. He places the heavy stack of legally certified papers precisely in the center of the large table. He informs the screaming woman and her stunned attorney that an invasive audit is completely unnecessary. He explains that these documents outline the absolute legal formation of a fully bulletproof, irrevocable trust. Simon states clearly that the massive wealth transfer was executed entirely within the strict bounds of federal corporate law. He emphasizes that I legally surrendered my personal ownership of the logistics empire weeks before she ever filed her hostile divorce petition. He speaks with a methodical and measured tone that completely neutralizes her hysterical outbursts. The irrevocable trust is a completely independent legal entity standing entirely separate from my personal financial identity. He outlines how I am now strictly a salaried employee functioning solely as a managing director for the corporation. I own absolutely no shares for her to aggressively seize today. He reminds Bradley that the local family court possesses absolutely zero legal jurisdiction to divide or conquer assets locked inside an independent trust. The mediator carefully reviews the primary pages and slowly nods in absolute agreement with Simon. The massive legal firewall I successfully erected is entirely impenetrable and completely permanent. Yvonne realizes she spent 8 months secretly hoarding a war chest to fight for a fortune that no longer exists on any marital ledger. The millions she desperately craved are legally protected behind a titanium wall she cannot ever breach. Her vicious plan to bleed me dry in court instantly shatters against the cold and unyielding reality of my superior financial restructuring. She completely lost the massive corporate empire long before she even dared to aggressively step foot inside this very room today. Bradley desperately attempts to salvage his rapidly collapsing litigation strategy. He aggressively grabs the initial thin folder to scour the active liability section for any possible legal loophole. He furiously scans the certified bank records detailing the remaining joint marital estate. He suddenly stops reading. His arrogant posture instantly deflates. He spots the fatal detail buried deep within the financial documentation. The blood completely drains from his face, turning him a sickly pale white. He realizes the horrifying magnitude of the trap I meticulously engineered. His trembling hands slowly push the certified promissory note across the smooth wood directly toward his highly confused client. He points a shaking finger at her own notarized signature, completely validating the document. The $4 million commercial business loan is absolutely and completely legally binding to the shared marital estate. He weakly attempts to explain the catastrophic situation to Yvonne. 3 years ago, she blindly signed a blanket guarantor form without reading a single paragraph. She carelessly authorized me to leverage the entire marital estate for massive commercial loans while she busily shopped for expensive luxury renovations. I utilized that forgotten legal signature to completely burden the joint accounts with immense corporate debt. The bank legally recognizes both of our names on this staggering commercial liability today. Bradley stares at the document with total professional terror. He truly understands he cannot possibly ever successfully argue against a fully certified banking contract carrying his own client's explicitly verified signature. He realizes I intentionally drained the estate of all liquid cash and replaced it with a highly radioactive financial bomb. He knows there is absolutely no legal avenue to escape this heavily ironclad agreement. The aggressive divorce settlement he proudly drafted has violently transformed into a massive financial execution for his incredibly greedy client here today. Simon recognizes the exact moment their arrogant resistance completely crumbles. He leans forward and officially delivers the ultimate lethal blow to their shattered litigation strategy. He coldly addresses Yvonne directly for the very first time today. He reminds her that she forcefully demanded an exact 50% split of the remaining marital estate during her aggressive opening statement. She stubbornly insisted on taking exactly half of everything currently listed in the joint financial portfolio. Simon calmly informs her that the family court will absolutely grant her unyielding request without any hesitation. By demanding that perfect 50% division, Yvonne has just legally inherited exactly $2 million of active high-interest commercial debt today. The immense financial liability is now permanently attached to her personal identity. She has absolutely zero corporate assets or real estate properties to sell to satisfy the aggressive commercial creditors. The $300,000 she secretly stole and hoarded in an offshore shell company will be instantly annihilated by the staggering loan interest alone. She thought she was brilliantly positioning herself to steal my life legacy and force me into extreme poverty. Instead, she successfully engineered her own absolute and entirely permanent financial destruction today. She is completely trapped inside a massive abyss of debt she can never possibly repay in her entire lifetime. She stares at the incredibly thin manila folder with wide, unblinking eyes. Her breathing becomes shallow and frantic as the horrifying reality of her situation fully registers. She eagerly wanted a brutally devastating divorce war, and I gladly gave her one. I utilized my decades of ruthless corporate experience to completely dismantle her entire future with a single signature. I sit back in my leather chair and watch the incredibly heavy financial guillotine completely sever her arrogant dreams forever today. The heavy steel lock on my private corporate office door splintered with a sharp, violent crack echoing loudly through the completely deserted executive hallway. Yvonne pushed the damaged door open and stumbled into the dark room. Her designer silk gown from the gala was wrinkled and completely disheveled. The absolute unyielding arrogance she proudly displayed just a few hours ago had completely evaporated. She frantically scanned the spacious room until her desperate eyes finally locked onto me sitting quietly behind my large mahogany desk. She did not march forward with the aggressive entitlement she usually commanded. She physically collapsed onto the plush Persian rug directly in front of my desk. She immediately launched into a highly theatrical display of profound emotional distress. She wailed loudly, burying her face in her hands to muffle the dramatic sobs tearing from her throat. She played the tragic role of a completely terrified and hopelessly confused woman desperately seeking comfort from the man she had just viciously attacked in public. She crawled forward on her hands and knees until she reached the heavy wooden edge of my desk. She grabbed the edge with white-knuckled fingers, looking up at me with mascara heavily smeared beneath her pleading eyes. She loudly wailed my name, demanding I save her from the absolute catastrophic nightmare currently suffocating her entirely. She presented herself as a fragile victim entirely overwhelmed by circumstances far beyond her personal control. I did not move from my leather chair. I simply watched the pathetic performance unfold before me with absolute, unwavering clinical detachment today. Yvonne desperately grabbed my sleeve, her tears soaking the expensive fabric of her tailored jacket. She begged me to immediately tear up the hostile divorce papers and forcefully halt the aggressive legal proceedings she had proudly initiated just hours earlier. Her voice trembled violently as she frantically spun a completely fabricated narrative to fully justify her vicious actions. She aggressively blamed her massive theft and the devastating public ambush on a temporary, profound lapse in mental judgment entirely caused by a sudden severe bout of clinical depression. She loudly insisted she was completely out of her mind and emotionally unstable when she initially contacted her ruthless divorce attorney. She desperately claimed that Bradley, the incredibly aggressive lawyer she personally hired, had maliciously manipulated her fragile emotional state. She swore he completely fabricated the terrible allegations of financial abuse and forcefully coerced her into signing the hostile divorce petition against her own free will. She desperately promised that she truly loved me and wanted absolutely nothing more than to immediately return to our quiet, comfortable life together. She painted Bradley as a predatory monster who entirely controlled her mind and forcefully pushed her into launching the devastating public attack at the anniversary gala. She sobbed heavily, swearing she never genuinely wanted any of my hard-earned money. She just desperately wanted my attention and my love today. She begged for an immediate chance to prove her absolute loyalty and unwavering devotion to our 40-year marriage right now. I sat completely still, listening to her rapidly construct a mountain of pathetic, transparent lies right here in my office tonight. I slowly pulled my arm away from her frantic, grasping hands. I calmly opened the bottom right drawer of my heavy mahogany desk. I silently retrieved a thick, unmarked manila envelope and placed it firmly on the smooth wooden surface between us. I did not speak a single word as I opened the flap and pulled out a massive stack of high-definition 8x10 glossy photographs. I casually tossed the heavy stack of pictures directly onto the Persian rug right in front of Yvonne's tear-stained face. The glossy images scattered across the expensive carpet, brightly illuminated by the solitary desk lamp. The photographs clearly and undeniably showed Yvonne lounging comfortably at an incredibly exclusive 5-star luxury resort located in the Caribbean. She was not alone in any of the highly detailed images. She was actively holding hands, intimately embracing and deeply kissing a muscular, significantly younger man. He appeared to be less than half her age, with a perfectly sculpted physique and an arrogant, entitled smirk plastered permanently across his face. The photos documented them sharing expensive champagne on a private yacht, passionately kissing on a secluded white sand beach, and walking hand in hand directly into a massive, heavily secluded luxury villa. Yvonne stared down at the scattered images. Her dramatic theatrical sobbing instantly ceased. Her mouth hung slightly open in absolute paralyzed shock. The completely irrefutable evidence of her incredibly lavish ongoing infidelity was laid bare right before her eyes. The meticulously constructed lie of her severe clinical depression and emotional vulnerability completely shattered against the undeniable reality of these photographs today. I leaned forward in my heavy leather chair and looked directly into Yvonne's completely terrified eyes. I calmly explained that my private investigator had relentlessly tracked every single dollar she aggressively siphoned from our joint marital accounts. The younger man prominently featured in the glossy photographs was her expensive personal trainer. She fully funded his luxurious lifestyle and their incredibly lavish Caribbean vacations using the $300,000 she secretly stole directly from my hard-earned corporate profits. I explicitly stated that her pathetic, tear-filled performance tonight was an absolutely useless waste of time. I firmly informed her that I absolutely refused her desperate, pathetic plea for reconciliation. I coldly declared that the hostile divorce proceedings she proudly initiated would absolutely proceed directly to a very public trial without a single delay. I promised her that every single photograph, every forged financial document, and every recorded lie would be officially submitted as public evidence in family court. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she was completely trapped in a massive legal nightmare entirely of her own incredibly greedy design. The irrevocable trust permanently shielded my immense fortune while the $4 million commercial loan guaranteed her total financial annihilation. I slowly stood up from my desk and pointed a firm finger directly toward the splintered office door. I ordered her to leave my corporate headquarters immediately and strictly warned her never to step foot on my property again. She scrambled to her feet and fled the dark office in absolute unmitigated terror today. The massive company 40th corporate anniversary gala officially began at the most upscale downtown hotel in the entire city tonight. Exactly 500 prominent industry leaders and wealthy corporate executives eagerly attended the highly anticipated luxury event. The grand ballroom glowed brightly beneath 3 massive crystal chandeliers illuminating the incredibly lavish celebration. Waiters in crisp white jackets constantly circulated through the wealthy crowd carrying heavy silver trays of incredibly expensive imported champagne. Flashbulbs popped incessantly near the main grand entrance as the local business press actively documented the prestigious arrival of the city elite. Yvonne confidently glided through the bustling center of the spacious room, wearing a breathtakingly beautiful custom silk gown. The incredibly intricate emerald fabric draped perfectly across her shoulders, reflecting the bright room lights. She selfishly purchased that exact designer dress using the staggering $300,000 she secretly and illegally stole directly from our joint marital accounts over the past 8 months. She smiled radiantly at the surrounding cameras and intimately linked her arm affectionately through mine. She played the completely fabricated role of the deeply devoted and entirely loving wife with absolutely flawless precision tonight. She warmly introduced me to visiting politicians and rival corporate executives while softly patting my chest to successfully project an unbroken image of absolute domestic bliss. I walked slowly beside her, completely aware of the venomous deception aggressively masking her beautiful features. I firmly shook hands with my oldest competitors and graciously accepted their incredibly warm congratulations on 4 full decades of uninterrupted commercial dominance. I painstakingly built this massive logistics empire by manually connecting heavy sheet metal in freezing warehouses while Yvonne slept comfortably in a very warm and comfortable bed. She now proudly paraded around this lavish room, entirely believing she would soon steal absolutely everything here from me. The incredibly cheerful master of ceremonies enthusiastically invited me to the beautifully elevated stage to deliver my own highly anticipated keynote speech. I slowly buttoned my tailored suit jacket and walked confidently up the carpeted stairs. I stood proudly behind the polished wooden podium and looked out across the vast sea of expectant faces. The massive room quieted down as I prepared to recount the brutal physical struggles that birthed this commercial empire. Before I could speak a single word into the active microphone, the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom violently swung open. The sudden loud crash echoed sharply across the quiet room. Attorney Bradley confidently marched down the center aisle with incredibly heavy and aggressive steps. He wore an expensive gray suit and a completely arrogant smirk explicitly designed to intimidate me. The 500 wealthy guests turned in their chairs to watch the highly bizarre interruption unfold. Bradley did not pause to acknowledge the intense audience confusion around him. He walked straight past the front row tables where my corporate board members sat in absolute stunned silence. He quickly climbed the stage stairs without an ounce of hesitation. He marched directly up to the wooden podium and forcefully slammed a thick stack of legal divorce documents right in front of the active microphone. The loud, aggressive thud resonated instantly through the massive ballroom speakers. The entire room fell completely dead silent immediately. You could easily hear a tiny pin drop on the thickly carpeted ballroom floor. Bradley puffed out his chest and successfully served me the hostile litigation papers in front of every single industry leader I deeply respected. He arrogantly stared at me with extreme predatory confidence, eagerly anticipating my total emotional collapse before this very enormous and incredibly quiet crowd watching tonight. Yvonne instantly unleashed her meticulously rehearsed theatrical performance for the heavily mesmerized audience. She stood up abruptly from her prominent front row seat and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. She loudly accused me of severe financial abuse and relentless emotional cruelty over the long span of our 40-year marriage. She projected her shrill voice expertly, ensuring her completely fabricated tears and dramatic sobs easily reached the very back of the massive ballroom tonight. She falsely claimed I treated her like a completely helpless prisoner while aggressively hoarding the vast corporate wealth she supposedly helped me build from the ground up. The 500 wealthy guests murmured in collective shock as she expertly painted herself as a tragically oppressed domestic victim. Attorney Bradley quickly grabbed the active microphone resting on the wooden podium. His voice boomed through the surrounding speakers with absolute aggressive authority. He publicly announced a devastating emergency court order specifically intended to immediately freeze all of my corporate and personal assets. He loudly proclaimed that my personal bank accounts, real estate holdings, and commercial properties were now completely locked by a powerful family court judge. He detailed exactly how he was forcefully halting all company operations to permanently prevent me from illegally hiding my immense wealth from his extremely vulnerable client. They had carefully coordinated this spectacular public ambush to totally maximize my profound humiliation. Yvonne and Bradley stood proudly together, completely convinced they had finally trapped me in an inescapable corner. They firmly expected me to quickly fall to my knees and desperately beg for mercy. They eagerly wanted me to violently explode in a massive fit of uncontrollable anger to instantly validate Yvonne's very vicious claims of emotional abuse. They excitedly awaited my complete and total public destruction right here tonight. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of visible panic. I calmly reached up and adjusted the perfect knot of my silk tie with completely steady hands. I looked down at the towering stack of hostile litigation documents resting aggressively on my wooden podium. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for my highly anticipated inevitable meltdown. I slowly picked up the heavy legal papers and tucked them neatly under my left arm. I turned my head and looked directly into Yvonne's eagerly expecting eyes. Her fake, dramatic tears instantly stopped flowing as she suddenly realized I was not completely shattering under her massive public pressure. I offered her a remarkably gentle and incredibly warm smile that deeply unsettled her core. I leaned directly into the active microphone so my final words would perfectly echo loudly through the enormous ballroom. I sincerely wished her the absolute best of luck in her wonderfully independent future endeavors. I told her I truly hoped she found the extraordinary wealth and profound happiness she was desperately seeking here tonight. I stepped away from the podium and calmly walked down the carpeted stairs without looking back a single time. I walked straight past Bradley, who stood absolutely frozen on the stage in utter disbelief. He had meticulously engineered this brutal theatrical ambush, expecting a wildly defensive and broken opponent. My chilling and totally emotionless reaction severely unnerved both Yvonne and her very aggressive lawyer today. They suddenly realized they had not trapped a frightened old man in a desperate corner. They had merely executed a completely useless performance against a fearless ghost. Their absolute confusion was delightfully evident as I calmly exited the completely silent and breathless ballroom. My impenetrable silence sent a terrifying warning straight down their spines tonight. The automatic glass doors of my corporate headquarters violently slid open. Courtney marched into the expansive marble lobby with the furious momentum of a completely deranged woman. She wore wrinkled designer clothes and heavily smeared makeup. The absolute loss of her expensive suburban home and her meticulously fabricated lifestyle had instantly driven her over the edge of sanity. She completely bypassed the front reception desk and aggressively shoved past two startled security guards. She marched directly toward the center of the lobby, where I proudly display the historical artifacts of my massive commercial logistics empire. She grabbed a heavy brass stanchion used for crowd control and forcefully swung it at the nearest glass display case. The thick glass shattered instantly with a deafening crash that echoed loudly across the polished marble floors. She destroyed the pristine case holding the very first set of worn leather work gloves I used to build this company from nothing. She aggressively swung the heavy brass pole again and completely obliterated a second display cabinet containing my original business ledger. Shards of broken safety glass rained down across the spotless floor. She screamed incoherently while actively destroying the tangible symbols of my lifetime of brutal physical labor. She behaved exactly like a spoiled toddler, throwing a massive tantrum over a broken toy. She fully blamed me for the terrifying consequences of her own incredible greed. She refused to accept that her husband signing a legally binding commercial loan guarantee caused her immediate financial ruin. She genuinely believed she was a tragic victim of my ruthless corporate maneuvering. She raised the heavy brass stanchion high above her head and shattered a third display case containing a scale model of our first commercial freight truck. Her absolute manic hysteria was a spectacular display of completely unrestrained suburban entitlement. I calmly stepped out of the private executive elevator and walked onto the second-floor mezzanine directly overlooking the main lobby. Courtney immediately spotted me standing near the glass railing and entirely lost her remaining shreds of basic human decency. She pointed the heavy brass stanchion directly at my chest and unleashed a vicious torrent of vile and highly racially charged insults. Her shrill voice echoed violently against the high marble walls for everyone to easily hear. She loudly called me a completely uneducated and extremely dangerous street thug who somehow manipulated his way into corporate wealth. She venomously screamed that my manual labor background was a permanent stain of absolute ghetto filth that money could never possibly wash away. She aggressively labeled me a profoundly ruthless predator who maliciously destroys his own loving family just to maintain total absolute control over a pathetic commercial empire. She paced back and forth across the shattered glass while spewing the most incredibly racist and entirely unforgivable slurs directly at me. She claimed my dark skin and rough working hands proved I was nothing more than a mindless animal completely incapable of feeling genuine human empathy. She violently struck the marble floor with the metal pole and loudly promised to completely ruin my professional reputation across this entire city. She aggressively swore she would utilize her extensive public relations network to permanently brand me as a violently abusive and highly dangerous criminal. She loudly declared she would personally call every single major news outlet and local television station to meticulously expose my supposedly fraudulent corporate operations. She firmly believed her incredibly venomous threats of massive social destruction would instantly force me to cowardly surrender to her unyielding financial demands here today. She remained completely oblivious to her own incredibly spectacular public self-destruction. I did not flinch or break eye contact as her racist vitriol echoed upward through the massive corporate atrium. My heavily armed private security team immediately rushed into the shattered lobby from their hidden observation posts. They quickly surrounded the violently thrashing woman and actively prepared to forcefully restrain her against the polished marble floor. I calmly raised my right hand and issued a direct verbal command ordering every single guard to immediately stand down. I explicitly instructed them to step back and allow her to continue freely destroying the glass cabinets. I simply rested my forearms on the cool glass railing and watched her absolutely humiliating performance continue uninterrupted. I completely refused to interrupt her incredibly toxic meltdown with any logical arguments or defensive statements. I let her completely exhaust her vocal cords, screaming vile obscenities directly at my neutral face. The expansive ground floor lobby was currently filled with dozens of highly alert corporate employees returning from their lunch breaks. They quickly gathered along the pristine marble walls and observed the chaotic scene in absolute stunned silence. Almost every single employee instinctively pulled out their advanced smartphones to digitally record the completely unhinged woman violently attacking my property. They perfectly captured her screaming those incredibly explicit and viciously racist slurs directly at the beloved founder of their company. Meanwhile, our state-of-the-art high-definition security cameras silently recorded every single angle of her spectacular criminal meltdown from the ceiling above. She was so entirely consumed by her blind, entitled rage that she never once noticed the glowing camera lenses directly aimed at her face. I stood quietly and graciously, allowed her to meticulously build an absolutely flawless digital archive of her own incredibly vile and highly irredeemable public behavior here in my lobby right now today. The raw smartphone footage of Courtney destroying my lobby completely leaked to multiple local media outlets and massive social platforms within the very first hour. The shocking high-definition videos spread across the internet with absolutely terrifying speed and incredible viral momentum. Thousands of furious strangers rapidly shared the crystal-clear clips of her violently screaming vile racist slurs directly at an older minority business owner. Every single major news station enthusiastically broadcast the horrifying footage during their extremely popular afternoon segments to generate massive public outrage. The entire city quickly watched her aggressively swing that heavy brass stanchion and violently shatter my beloved historical display cases into tiny pieces. Her carefully constructed public image as a highly sophisticated and deeply compassionate professional was totally shredded in a matter of mere minutes. The overwhelming digital backlash was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless against her entirely fabricated suburban prestige. By sunset, the massive corporate communications firm where she proudly worked as a senior public relations director desperately scrambled into brutal crisis management mode. They actively monitored the rapidly exploding social media disaster and realized she had become a completely toxic radioactive liability. They absolutely refused to publicly associate their prestigious brand with her violently racist and highly destructive public behavior. Courtney sat weeping inside a cheap motel room when her smartphone buzzed with a highly anticipated notification. She nervously opened a perfectly sterile corporate email directly from her enraged chief executive officer. The incredibly brief message officially terminated her lucrative employment contract, completely effective immediately without any possibility of severance pay. Her incredibly expensive professional career was instantly and permanently annihilated by her own incredibly foolish actions. The total financial and social destruction she wildly promised to inflict upon my legacy had beautifully landed directly upon her own pathetic head tonight. Yvonne sat alone inside her idling vehicle, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of her massive legal nightmare. The family court strictly froze her remaining credit cards and completely locked her out of the luxurious suburban estate. She was suddenly entirely destitute and practically homeless within a matter of hours. She desperately gripped the leather steering wheel of her expensive imported car, trying to formulate a viable escape plan. Her panicked mind immediately raced toward the young personal trainer she had been secretly funding for the past 8 months. She aggressively slammed her foot on the accelerator and sped directly toward his upscale downtown apartment complex. She firmly believed the staggering $300,000 she illegally embezzled from my corporate accounts was safely hidden inside his offshore shell company. She desperately needed that stolen fortune returned immediately to hire a competent defense attorney to somehow fight my flawless financial trap. She bypassed the building concierge and rushed wildly into the private residential elevator. She sprinted down the long, carpeted hallway with her heavy designer heels clicking loudly against the floor. She reached his expensive corner unit and aggressively pounded her manicured fists against the heavy wooden door. She loudly demanded he open the door right now to discuss their urgent financial crisis. She screamed his name through the thick wood while frantically looking over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching her humiliating breakdown. She practically begged him to transfer the stolen corporate funds back into her personal bank account today. She fully expected her incredibly handsome lover to immediately comfort her and provide the massive financial rescue she desperately required tonight. She waited impatiently in the quiet hallway, expecting a warm and loving reception to swiftly save her rapidly crumbling existence from total absolute ruin right now. The heavy wooden door finally cracked open just a few incredibly narrow inches. The thick steel chain lock remained firmly secured against the metal doorframe. The younger man peered out into the dimly lit hallway with a completely recognizable sneer painted perfectly across his handsome face. Yvonne aggressively pushed against the solid wood, desperately trying to force her way inside his private sanctuary. He easily held the door steady and let out a viciously cruel laugh directly in her pathetic, tearful face. He looked at her ruined designer gown and completely disheveled appearance with absolute unadulterated disgust. He did not offer her a single ounce of comfort or any basic human empathy tonight. He brutally mocked her advancing age and wildly laughed at her profound, astonishing gullibility. He completely stripped away the romantic illusion she had so desperately worshipped for the past 8 months. He explicitly confirmed he never genuinely cared about her shallow personality or her fabricated emotional needs. He confidently stated he only engaged in the secretive romantic affair to gain unfettered access to my massive corporate fortune. He happily treated her like a remarkably foolish bank account that eagerly dispensed endless luxury vacations and incredibly expensive designer gifts. He coldly informed her that their entire illicit relationship was strictly a deeply calculated financial transaction from the very first day they met. He viciously reminded her that a man in his absolute physical prime would never voluntarily pursue a pathetic aging woman unless massive amounts of free money were consistently involved. He grinned maliciously while watching her heart completely shatter into 1,000 tiny, irreversible pieces right there in the hallway. He expertly twisted the painful, emotional knife deep into her completely devastated ego, making sure she fully understood her absolute total worthlessness right here tonight forever. Yvonne forcefully jammed her manicured fingers into the incredibly narrow gap, desperately attempting to pry the heavy door wider. She loudly begged him to immediately transfer the $300,000 back to her frozen accounts. She desperately promised him they could completely escape this terrifying legal nightmare and quickly start over somewhere beautifully tropical together. He looked at her frantically grasping hands and delivered a profoundly devastating financial blow. He bluntly revealed that the massive offshore fortune she illegally transferred to him was entirely and completely gone. He confidently explained he never bothered to save a single penny of her stolen money inside a secure banking account. He coldly confessed he gambled away the entire $300,000 trading highly volatile cryptocurrency assets several weeks ago. He arrogantly admitted he lost absolutely everything chasing incredibly risky digital investments trying to rapidly multiply the stolen cash. He completely shattered her desperate final hope of securing a competent defense attorney to somehow fight my flawless litigation. He stared directly into her horrified eyes and explicitly stated there was absolutely zero money left to return to her tonight. He laughed at her staggering foolishness for blindly trusting a younger man with her illegally obtained corporate funds without demanding a single financial guarantee. He meticulously explained that the offshore shell company was completely bankrupt and permanently shuttered. He proudly reminded her that the original wire transfers were completely untraceable gifts, making her entirely liable for the massive corporate theft. She instantly realized he had eagerly and ruthlessly drained her stolen millions just as maliciously as she had violently drained my commercial accounts. Her desperate breathing became incredibly shallow as the terrifying reality of her absolute financial ruin permanently cemented itself in her completely broken and entirely devastated mind right here tonight, forever. He abruptly removed his right hand from the thick steel chain lock and forcefully slammed the heavy wooden door directly in her face. The incredibly loud noise echoed sharply down the completely deserted residential hallway. The heavy metal deadbolt clicked securely shut, locking her completely out of his life forever. Yvonne stood entirely frozen in the cold and dimly lit corridor, perfectly illuminated by a single flickering overhead light. Her incredibly expensive designer gown hung limply across her trembling frame like a pathetic shroud. She slowly lowered her manicured hands and stared blankly at the solid wooden barrier completely separating her from her completely shattered romantic delusion. The absolutely deafening silence of the empty apartment building heavily pressed down upon her completely broken shoulders tonight. She finally realized the staggering magnitude of her exceptionally foolish and entirely malicious betrayal. She had willingly destroyed a solid 40-year marriage built on unwavering dedication and mutual respect for a deeply pathetic and entirely fabricated illusion. She aggressively threw away her guaranteed half of a massive $10 million commercial logistics empire simply to chase a remarkably cheap and entirely hollow fantasy. Her incredible arrogance convinced her she was brilliantly manipulating everyone around her to secure absolute freedom and endless wealth. She suddenly understood she was nothing more than a highly gullible pawn aggressively exploited by a deeply predatory young man who cared only for her stolen corporate cash. She slowly collapsed against the cold drywall and slid completely down to the incredibly hard and unforgiving carpeted floor. She buried her tearful face deep into her shaking hands, realizing she had single-handedly engineered her own permanent and utterly catastrophic destruction here today. She wept bitterly, knowing she would never, ever successfully recover her completely lost elite luxury life right now forever today. Yvonne stood shivering in the dimly lit hallway for nearly an hour before finally dragging herself back to her luxury sedan. She gripped the cold leather steering wheel with trembling hands. Her meticulously planned future had completely evaporated into thin air. She desperately scrolled through her smartphone trying to locate any sympathetic friends or wealthy acquaintances who might offer her a temporary haven. She found absolutely no one. Every single elite socialite she routinely entertained had instantly severed ties the moment the public scandal erupted. The high society she desperately craved completely abandoned her the second her stolen money vanished. She frantically checked her mobile banking application, praying for a miracle. The screen flashed a terrifying error message. The aggressive commercial creditors holding the $4 million loan had legally seized her accounts. Her personal checking and savings balances showed absolute zero. She was completely cut off from every single financial lifeline she possessed. With nowhere else to turn, she aggressively slammed her foot on the accelerator and sped toward the sprawling suburban subdivision where her son lived. She firmly believed Devin would immediately welcome her with open arms and provide the comfortable sanctuary she so desperately required tonight. She pulled into the wide driveway and parked her expensive vehicle behind his new imported sports car. She eagerly marched up the concrete walkway and practically threw herself against the heavy oak front door. She pounded her fists against the wood, demanding immediate entry to escape the terrifying reality closing in around her right now. Courtney finally jerked the front door open with absolute violent force. She did not offer a warm greeting or a comforting embrace. She actively blocked the entire doorway with her body. Her eyes burned with pure, unadulterated hatred as she stared down at her mother-in-law. Yvonne frantically begged for a safe place to sleep tonight, claiming she was the tragic victim of my ruthless corporate maneuvering. Courtney cut her off with a viciously sharp laugh. She completely unleashed a devastating torrent of verbal abuse directly into Yvonne's tearful face. She aggressively labeled her mother-in-law a catastrophic financial liability and a completely broke parasite. She loudly screamed that Yvonne's incredibly foolish greed had directly endangered their own lavish lifestyle. She absolutely refused to allow Yvonne to step a single foot inside their pristine suburban home. She explicitly stated she would never legally or financially support a completely destitute woman who squandered a massive corporate fortune on a pathetic young lover. The absolute lack of basic family loyalty hit Yvonne like a physical blow to the chest. She desperately pleaded with Courtney to show a single ounce of basic human compassion tonight. She completely ignored Yvonne's pathetic sobs and forcefully maintained her aggressive blockade of the front entrance. Courtney explicitly reminded her that their relationship was entirely transactional and heavily based on the massive wealth Yvonne used to control. Now that the stolen money was completely gone, the transaction was officially terminated forever. She coldly ordered Yvonne to immediately leave their property before she actively called the local police to forcefully remove a trespassing vagrant today. A dark, unmarked sedan slowly pulled into the wide suburban driveway, perfectly blocking Yvonne's luxury vehicle from exiting. A tall man wearing a cheap suit stepped out of the driver's side holding a thick metal clipboard. He confidently walked past Yvonne, completely ignoring her dramatic sobbing. He marched directly up the concrete steps and stopped right in front of Courtney. Devin emerged from the hallway, hearing the loud commotion on his front porch. The man with the clipboard professionally asked for Devin by his full legal name. Devin cautiously stepped forward to confirm his identity. The man efficiently handed Devin a thick stack of aggressively stapled legal documents. He formally announced that he was an official process server acting on behalf of the commercial lending bank. He explicitly stated the heavy paperwork was a completely certified foreclosure notice. He calmly explained that the incredibly expensive imported sports car parked in the driveway had officially triggered a massive financial default. The massive promissory note I forced them to sign weeks ago had immediately activated due to severely missed corporate payment deadlines. Devin stared blindly down at the dense legal text, completely failing to comprehend the catastrophic reality of the situation. He arrogantly believed I was still blindly funding his incredibly lavish lifestyle despite the ongoing divorce warfare. He never bothered to actually read the heavily structured fine print outlining the incredibly strict collateral conditions. The process server offered a highly practiced artificial smile and quickly walked back to his unmarked car. He successfully delivered the lethal financial payload, leaving Devin completely paralyzed on his own front porch. The terrifying consequences of their absolute uncontrollable greed had officially arrived to collect its heavy due today. Yvonne slowly turned around and stared at the heavy foreclosure documents currently trembling in her son's pale hands. She finally realized the staggering magnitude of the incredibly lethal trap I meticulously constructed around them all. Devin's massive suburban home was absolutely legally tied to the very commercial debt she had just blindly inherited from the shattered marital estate. Because her personal bank accounts were entirely frozen by aggressive creditors, the absolute failure to pay the corporate loan activated the absolute final phase of my plan. The massive commercial lending bank was now legally seizing Devin and Courtney's pristine home to cover the massive missing liquidity. The incredibly expensive imported sports car they so arrogantly demanded had completely triggered the total absolute destruction of their entire fabricated reality. The heavy promissory note they eagerly signed without reading a single word explicitly authorized the immediate eviction process. Yvonne stood entirely frozen on the concrete walkway, completely paralyzed by the horrifying truth. She watched Devin's arrogant confidence utterly shatter into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Courtney let out a completely hysterical scream of pure rage as the devastating reality fully registered in her greedy mind. She violently shoved Devon backward and demanded he immediately fix the catastrophic disaster rapidly destroying their comfortable lives. Yvonne slowly backed away from the porch, completely overwhelmed by a suffocating wave of profound, absolute guilt. She realized she had single-handedly engineered the absolute total destruction of her own son's life today. Her endless greed had not only completely annihilated her own future, but deeply poisoned everyone she forcefully dragged into her toxic orbit. The absolute complete financial ruin they all arrogantly believed they could permanently avoid had completely consumed them entirely right here tonight. I stood completely still on the sweeping wraparound porch of my expansive suburban estate. The early morning air carried a sharp and biting chill that perfectly matched the absolute finality of today. I watched a marked county patrol cruiser slowly turn off the main street and glide up the long, winding driveway. The heavy vehicle came to a smooth halt directly in front of the wide stone steps. Two fully armed sheriff deputies stepped out of the front doors with incredibly stern and highly professional expressions permanently fixed on their faces. Yvonne emerged from the back seat of the cruiser looking completely hollowed out and entirely defeated by her massive legal failures. Her posture was completely broken. She no longer possessed a single ounce of the vicious arrogance she proudly displayed at the corporate anniversary gala. The senior deputy confidently marched up the concrete steps, holding a thick manila folder securely in his right hand. He approached Yvonne and officially handed her the finalized court-ordered eviction mandate. The heavy legal document featured the unmistakable bright red seal of the family court judge who formally executed her absolute financial ruin. The senior deputy loudly and explicitly informed her that this massive residential property was now the exclusive legal possession of the irrevocable trust. He firmly stated she no longer held any legal rights or residential privileges regarding the estate she once arrogantly treated as her personal kingdom. She stared down at the damning paperwork, trembling violently as the absolute, undeniable reality of her total homelessness completely crushed her fragile, broken spirit. I remained entirely silent near the towering marble columns. I watched the aggressive legal machinery I meticulously activated forcefully strip away the very last remaining fragment of her deeply fabricated and thoroughly toxic suburban illusion right here today. The senior deputy stepped back and rested his heavy hand directly on his thick utility belt. He looked down at the completely shattered woman and delivered the incredibly harsh secondary instructions mandated by the family court. He formally informed Yvonne that she possessed exactly 20 minutes to actively enter the residential property and swiftly gather her basic personal clothing. He loudly explained she was completely prohibited from entirely removing any expensive jewelry, valuable artwork, or luxury electronics from the massive estate. The highly specific court order explicitly permitted her to extract only a single small suitcase filled exclusively with everyday wearable garments. The second armed deputy aggressively unclipped his radio and firmly warned her against attempting to secretly steal any lucrative corporate assets permanently belonging to the protected trust. He stared directly into her panicked eyes and loudly clarified the terrifying absolute legal consequences of any unauthorized removal. He explicitly stated that any personal items, valuable designer clothes, or expensive luxury goods left behind after the 20-minute deadline expired would be officially classified as completely abandoned property. He ruthlessly confirmed the massive residential estate would be immediately locked and perfectly secured by professional security contractors within the hour. Any remaining possessions trapped inside the incredibly large home would be forcefully gathered, entirely bagged, and aggressively transported directly to a local municipal landfill for absolute immediate destruction. Yvonne gasped loudly as the devastating reality of her massive material loss completely suffocated her greedy mind. She frantically scrambled up the wide stone steps, moving with absolute terrifying urgency. The two armed deputies followed closely behind her, constantly watching every single desperate movement she made inside the house. Her entire meticulously constructed identity was being violently ripped completely away from her greedy hands right here forever today, without any shred of mercy. The 20-minute deadline finally expired with absolute ruthless precision. Yvonne slowly emerged from the grand front doors, clutching the incredibly cheap plastic handle of a single black rolling suitcase. She looked completely pathetic, dragging the tiny bag containing the absolute bare minimum of her previously incredibly lavish wardrobe. The tiny plastic wheels rattled aggressively against the pristine concrete driveway, breaking the extremely heavy silence surrounding the massive estate today. She walked with heavily slumped shoulders and deeply bowed head, entirely stripped of the arrogant entitlement she wielded like a deadly weapon for decades. The two armed deputies followed closely behind her, constantly making sure she did not attempt to frantically rush back inside the heavily protected residence. They strictly guided her away from the towering marble columns and forcefully marched her directly toward the massive iron security gates securely bordering the main public road. Yvonne stopped walking just inches before crossing the final legal threshold separating my protected sanctuary from the cold, unforgiving outside world. She slowly rotated her trembling body and looked directly back at me, standing silently on the wide wraparound porch. Her heavily smeared mascara completely ruined her beautiful face as thick tears constantly streamed down her pale cheeks. She stared up at me with deeply desperate and entirely terrified eyes, silently pleading for one final miraculous act of completely unmerited grace. She desperately wanted me to suddenly break my incredibly stoic demeanor and generously invite her back inside our incredibly warm home. She desperately prayed I would somehow instantly forgive her incredibly massive betrayal and violently destructive financial theft right here today. She stood absolutely frozen near the incredibly towering iron security gates, silently begging for a completely impossible redemption she fully knew she absolutely never, ever rightfully deserved from me right here, right now. I firmly maintained absolute unyielding eye contact with the completely shattered woman, standing entirely alone at the edge of my magnificent property. I absolutely refused to offer her a single fraction of the miraculous forgiveness she so desperately and pathetically sought today. My incredibly calm and completely emotionless expression perfectly mirrored the absolute coldness she viciously displayed when she illegally funneled my hard-earned fortune to her young lover. I slowly turned my back on her weeping figure and calmly walked across the wide stone porch toward the grand entrance of the incredibly massive estate. I confidently reached out and firmly grabbed the heavy brass handle of the towering solid wood front door. The cool polished metal felt incredibly solid and deeply reassuring against my steady working hands right now. I completely ignored the loud, desperate wail she suddenly unleashed from the iron gates, actively echoing across the perfectly manicured front lawn. I forcefully pulled the massive wooden door entirely shut, completely blocking her tragic existence from my peaceful private sanctuary. The incredibly loud and definitively sharp click of the heavy steel deadbolt instantly resonated through the totally empty grand foyer. That highly unmistakable metallic sound officially and permanently sealed away exactly 4 full decades of toxic marital history forever. I methodically constructed a completely inescapable financial guillotine and patiently allowed her own uncontrollable greed to trigger the absolute devastating drop. She walked away completely destitute, carrying absolutely nothing but a tiny plastic suitcase and the massive crushing weight of her own utterly foolish destruction. I stood entirely alone in the perfectly quiet hallway, completely surrounded by the magnificent, unshakable empire I legally secured and fiercely protected against her vicious and entirely pathetic betrayal. My incredibly brilliant and completely flawless tactical plan finally brought me absolute total victory today. The deafening roar of heavy diesel engines and massive steel freight containers echoed relentlessly across the incredibly busy commercial logistics warehouse today. Devin aggressively pushed his way through the bustling loading dock, entirely ignoring the blaring backup sirens of massive yellow forklifts navigating the crowded concrete floor. His expensive tailored suit completely clashed with the incredibly dirty industrial environment surrounding him right now. He furiously stomped past towering stacks of wooden pallets and forcefully shoved a startled dock worker out of his immediate path. He frantically scanned the massive facility until his enraged eyes finally locked onto me standing near the main shipping terminal. I was methodically reviewing a thick stack of commercial transport manifests on a heavy metal clipboard. Devin did not cautiously approach me with the basic professional respect required in a highly dangerous industrial workspace. He recklessly stormed directly across the active loading zone, completely disregarding the strict safety protocols I meticulously established decades ago. A massive freight loader violently slammed its heavy hydraulic brakes to avoid crushing him against a solid steel support beam. The furious driver loudly blasted his incredibly loud horn at the completely unhinged trespasser. Devin entirely ignored the massive near-death experience and continued his furious march directly toward my supervisory station. His face was intensely flushed with bright red rage, and his hands were tightly balled into completely solid white fists. He aggressively closed the final distance between us and forcefully slapped his open palms down hard on my metal workstation table. The loud metallic crash briefly cut through the overwhelming industrial noise. He aggressively invaded my personal space with absolutely zero hesitation. He stood directly in my face, breathing incredibly heavily while preparing to unleash a massive wave of completely misplaced anger right here on the active commercial warehouse floor. Devin immediately unleashed a completely deafening barrage of incredibly vile accusations, perfectly projecting his absolute refusal to accept personal accountability. He violently pointed his trembling finger directly at my chest, completely blaming me for the absolute catastrophic destruction of his entire pathetic life. He screamed that I possessed a deeply black and incredibly malicious heart, purposefully designed to ruthlessly annihilate my own flesh and blood. He aggressively accused me of maliciously seizing his sprawling suburban house simply to satisfy a deeply twisted desire for absolute corporate power. He loudly yelled that Courtney completely shattered their marital vows and rapidly filed for hostile divorce earlier this very morning. He viciously stated she permanently packed her expensive designer luggage and immediately took my innocent grandson completely away from him forever. He aggressively blamed my highly strategic legal foreclosure for entirely breaking his beautifully fabricated family into a million tiny, irrecoverable pieces. He completely ignored the absolute indisputable fact that his own incredible and deeply blind greed had explicitly authorized the massive financial collateral agreement. He furiously, completely refused to openly acknowledge his own spectacular failures regarding the extremely massive and completely defaulted commercial loan. He passionately screamed that my cold logistics empire meant absolutely nothing without a loyal family standing directly behind it. He desperately painted himself as a profoundly tragic and totally innocent victim, utterly destroyed by a highly vindictive and extremely tyrannical father. He paced frantically back and forth across the dirty concrete floor, aggressively shouting that I forcefully robbed him of his very own child today. His wildly unhinged rant brilliantly echoed the incredibly pathetic entitlement he desperately weaponized to mask his utter profound weakness right here and right now. I stood completely silent, actively watching him severely embarrass himself in front of absolutely everyone working nearby here today. I completely ignored his incredibly pathetic and entirely childish emotional outburst. I methodically turned toward the solid steel storage cabinet securely mounted directly behind my operational workstation. I slowly opened the heavy metal door and calmly reached inside without speaking a single word. I firmly grasped a bright neon orange high-visibility safety vest constructed from extremely durable synthetic mesh. I silently pulled out a heavily scuffed and incredibly dense yellow industrial hard hat required for all manual labor personnel. I calmly turned back around to fully face my violently shaking and extremely furious son. I methodically raised the highly protective safety gear and forcefully tossed both items directly into his completely tailored chest. Devin reflexively caught the bright industrial equipment with incredibly awkward and totally uncoordinated hands. He stared down at the neon orange fabric, completely paralyzed by absolute profound confusion. I looked directly into his tearful eyes and explicitly offered him his very first entirely genuine employment opportunity. I completely bypassed any executive management roles and directly assigned him a strictly manual labor position, loading extremely heavy freight trucks. I explicitly stated he would immediately begin working the incredibly grueling midnight graveyard shift for strict base minimum wage compensation. I forcefully explained he would successfully learn the true backbreaking value of a single dollar by physically hauling heavy wooden pallets until dawn. I strictly promised him absolutely no special corporate privileges and zero executive leniency regarding his daily physical performance here. I formally informed him this was the absolute only financial salvation I would ever offer him again. He stood entirely frozen, desperately clutching the incredibly dirty industrial safety equipment, while the devastating reality of his new manual labor existence completely shattered his deeply arrogant and entirely fabricated suburban illusions right here on the active warehouse floor today. Devin stared at the neon orange vest and scuffed yellow helmet resting helplessly in his incredibly soft hands. His face violently twisted into a remarkably ugly mask of pure, unadulterated disgust and absolute blinding arrogance. He utterly refused to ever demean his entirely fabricated high society status by voluntarily performing a single hour of actual physical labor. He let out a completely savage scream of profound outrage and forcefully hurled the protective safety equipment directly onto the dirty concrete warehouse floor. The heavy industrial plastic helmet bounced aggressively across the incredibly dusty cement, creating a loud, hollow, echoing sound. He violently kicked the bright orange mesh vest aside, utilizing his incredibly expensive imported leather dress shoes. He aggressively raised his perfectly manicured hands toward the high ceiling and unleashed a final devastating barrage of highly toxic profanity entirely aimed at my soul. He explicitly promised to never ever forgive me for successfully tearing apart his perfectly crafted suburban empire tonight. He abruptly turned his back and furiously stormed away from my supervisory station, moving with absolute unhinged momentum. He aggressively navigated his way back through the massive towering stacks of extremely heavy wooden freight pallets, entirely avoiding the massively loud forklifts crossing his path. I silently watched his rapidly shrinking figure completely disappear out the enormous steel shipping doors into the completely bitter, cold, dark night. I did not attempt to call him back or offer a single incredibly foolish word of unearned comfort today. The exceptionally toxic and completely destructive coddling that permanently poisoned his incredibly weak character was absolutely and officially over, forever. I calmly turned my entire body back around toward my heavy metal workstation table. I picked up my thick metal clipboard and quietly returned to methodically reviewing my incredibly massive commercial shipping manifests right now. Exactly 8 agonizing weeks passed since the heavy steel deadbolt permanently locked Yvonne out of her lavish suburban reality. She spent those 2 incredibly long months surviving inside a remarkably cheap extended stay motel situated near the heavily polluted industrial district. The drastic transition from an opulent $10 million estate to a decaying cinderblock room severely deteriorated her remaining mental stability. She absolutely refused to accept her permanent financial annihilation and aggressively decided to launch one final spectacular legal offensive against my unshakable corporate empire. She formally filed an incredibly desperate civil countersuit within the congested county court system yesterday morning. Her wildly fabricated legal filings aggressively accused me of utilizing highly fraudulent accounting practices to secretly establish the incredibly powerful irrevocable trust. She explicitly claimed I maliciously manipulated highly complex corporate tax structures to intentionally hide massive amounts of commercial wealth from our shared marital estate. She loudly alleged that I actively coerced her into absolute extreme poverty by deliberately withholding vital financial information throughout our entire 4-decade marriage. She desperately painted herself as a remarkably innocent and severely oppressed victim of a highly sophisticated domestic economic conspiracy. Her deeply ridiculous lawsuit vehemently demanded an immediate federal investigation into my private commercial logistics ledgers and personal investment portfolios. She entirely ignored her own massive, unpunished embezzlement and explicitly requested full punitive damages for severe emotional distress. She confidently believed this aggressive legal assault would finally terrify me into offering a massive out-of-court financial settlement. She fundamentally misunderstood the absolute impenetrable strength of the legal fortress I had methodically built around my entire legacy. She was now blindly marching directly toward another exceptionally brutal and totally humiliating public execution today. Her incredible arrogance continuously fueled her uniquely profound personal destruction right here and right now forever. Yvonne officially retained an incredibly cheap and highly desperate local attorney entirely willing to actively pursue her ridiculous civil litigation on a strictly percentage-based contingency fee. She completely lacked the massive upfront retainer required to successfully hire a genuinely competent legal professional today. This low-rate strip mall lawyer possessed absolutely zero meaningful experience actively fighting high-stakes corporate financial battles against exceptionally well-funded corporate defense teams. Together, they aggressively attempted to paint me as an incredibly tyrannical and intensely manipulative domestic abuser who intentionally utilized psychological intimidation to permanently hide immense wealth. The sloppy attorney submitted dozens of wildly speculative court motions explicitly accusing me of completely brainwashing my incredibly naive wife throughout our very long marriage. He loudly argued that I forcefully isolated her from all professional financial advisors to intentionally prevent her from actively discovering the true staggering magnitude of my commercial logistics empire. They aggressively claimed that my intensely focused dedication to rapidly expanding the massive freight company was actually a highly sinister tactic designed to systematically strip away her fundamental marital rights. They desperately submitted entirely fabricated character testimonies, attempting to officially label me an exceptionally dangerous financial predator who entirely dominated her completely fragile mind. Yvonne constantly wept throughout her initial deposition, explicitly stating she was completely terrified to ever question my absolute authority regarding our shared corporate finances. She forcefully played the tragically vulnerable victim role perfectly, expecting the presiding civil judge to immediately freeze my completely shielded operational assets out of sheer judicial pity. She deeply believed her incredibly theatrical tears and his aggressively loud courtroom theatrics would successfully override my incredibly solid contractual documentation. She entirely failed to realize that completely undeniable objective truth permanently trumps wildly emotional fabrications within a highly scrutinized legal environment every single time guaranteed. The official discovery deposition was held inside a highly sterile and aggressively bright corporate conference room. Yvonne sat confidently beside her incredibly cheap attorney while continuously dabbing her completely dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. She aggressively reiterated her entirely fabricated narrative of severe financial coercion and absolute emotional isolation. My brilliantly ruthless corporate attorney Simon sat perfectly still directly across the polished mahogany table, actively recording her perjurious statements. He waited incredibly patiently for her to completely finish spinning her massive web of absolutely desperate lies before making his exceptionally lethal move. Simon calmly reached into his tailored suit jacket and silently retrieved a small silver flash drive. He methodically dropped the tiny digital storage device directly onto the center of the heavy wooden table. The sharp metallic clink instantly shattered the thick tension filling the completely quiet room. Simon proudly announced that the drive contained a meticulously preserved high-definition video recording from exactly 3 years prior. He explicitly explained the completely unedited corporate footage perfectly documented a highly voluntary meeting inside my private executive office. He calmly instructed the assigned legal videographer to immediately play the digital file on the massive television monitor mounted firmly against the back wall. The exceptionally clear video loudly played, showing Yvonne sitting extremely comfortably in my plush leather chair. She was visibly euphoric and completely relaxed while eagerly reviewing a highly detailed post-nuptial property waiver. She cheerfully joked with my corporate notary and happily signed every single page without reading a single legal paragraph. She enthusiastically executed the ironclad contract with absolutely zero hesitation and practically zero oversight. The absolute indisputable digital evidence completely annihilated her incredibly pathetic false claims of psychological manipulation and severe domestic terror right in front of her exceptionally incompetent and completely stunned lawyer here today. The incredibly damning video explicitly proved Yvonne willfully traded her entire future claims to the massive corporate assets in direct exchange for an absolutely unlimited premium credit card. The high-definition footage clearly showed her loudly bragging about finally securing unrestricted access to my vast personal checking accounts to freely fund her lavish shopping sprees. The clear audio explicitly captured her openly mocking the exact same logistics empire she was currently attempting to violently legally plunder. She entirely surrendered her absolute legal rights to the commercial enterprise simply to aggressively finance her incredibly expensive designer clothing and endless tropical vacations. Her very own documented and profoundly undeniable greed completely destroyed the desperately fabricated civil lawsuit within a matter of minutes. The remarkably cheap attorney instantly stopped defending her and physically backed away from the polished mahogany table in absolute total embarrassment. He angrily realized she had explicitly lied to his face regarding her total lack of contractual knowledge just to secure his contingency representation. The presiding civil judge heavily reviewed the indisputable digital evidence and stared down at Yvonne with pure, unadulterated legal disgust. He aggressively struck his heavy wooden gavel and formally dismissed her entire fraudulent case with absolute extreme prejudice. He loudly warned her that any further frivolous litigation attempts would immediately result in severe criminal perjury charges and massive financial sanctions. Yvonne sat entirely frozen in her heavy leather chair, completely paralyzed by the astonishingly swift and absolutely catastrophic legal defeat. She silently watched her absolute final pathetic avenue of financial salvation permanently evaporate into thin air right before her terrified eyes. My incredibly flawless and entirely impenetrable corporate defense successfully executed her absolute total ruin and permanently secured my massive $10 million legacy from her utterly toxic and totally unforgivable grasp forever right here today. The absolute finality of Yvonne's legal defeat was rapidly eclipsed by a completely separate and far more devastating crisis brewing across the city. Heavily armed federal agents gathered silently in the dark corridors of the upscale downtown apartment complex shortly before dawn. They moved with absolute tactical precision toward the exact corner unit where Yvonne had suffered her profoundly humiliating rejection just 2 months prior. The heavy wooden door abruptly splintered inward under the massive kinetic force of a steel battering ram. The deafening crash violently shattered the quiet morning air as tactical officers flooded the luxurious living space. The arrogant young personal trainer abruptly jolted awake to find a dozen incredibly bright tactical flashlights aimed directly at his terrified face. He was immediately yanked from his incredibly expensive silk sheets and forcefully pinned face down against the polished hardwood floor. His characteristic smugness completely vanished as cold steel handcuffs locked aggressively around his wrists. The commanding federal agent loudly read him his absolute legal rights while explicitly detailing a massive list of severe federal felony charges. The young man was officially arrested for actively operating an extensive multi-state online wire fraud syndicate. The aggressive federal cybercrime division had spent an entire year meticulously tracking his highly volatile cryptocurrency transactions and deeply illicit digital shell companies. They successfully traced the massive network of heavily laundered funds directly back to his personal digital wallets. The incredibly lavish lifestyle he aggressively funded, utilizing stolen corporate money and fraudulent investment schemes, had officially triggered a massive federal hammer. He was aggressively marched down the carpeted hallway in absolute disgrace while federal technicians actively seized every single computer and encrypted storage device inside his apartment. His deeply pathetic house of digital cards completely collapsed into absolute criminal ruin right here today, perfectly, forever, and permanently. The terrified young man sat completely paralyzed inside a remarkably cold federal interrogation room, permanently facing decades behind thick concrete walls. His previously unstoppable arrogance totally vanished the exact moment aggressive federal prosecutors methodically presented an absolutely inescapable mountain of completely undeniable digital evidence against him. He forcefully realized his incredibly lavish criminal lifestyle was totally destroyed forever without any single remaining loophole today. He desperately sobbed while officially sitting beside a remarkably cheap public defender, absolutely begging for any available judicial mercy. The incredibly ruthless federal prosecutors explicitly demanded completely cooperative criminal testimony regarding his heavily encrypted digital money laundering network. Facing an absolute mandatory maximum federal prison sentence, the pathetic young lover instantly broke down and completely surrendered every single illicit secret he aggressively hoarded. He practically leapt at the highly restrictive federal plea deal generously offered by the completely stoic prosecuting attorney right across the metal table. He explicitly testified that Yvonne willfully and actively stole highly confidential client manifests directly from my incredibly secure corporate logistics servers. He loudly confessed she maliciously utilized those extremely sensitive commercial documents to successfully siphon hundreds of thousands of untraceable dollars completely straight into his completely fraudulent cryptocurrency accounts. He aggressively provided the highly focused federal agents with explicit digital communication logs, definitively proving Yvonne enthusiastically financed his entirely illicit multi-state wire fraud operations. He totally betrayed his incredibly wealthy former lover without a single solitary ounce of human hesitation or basic moral regret today. He entirely sacrificed her remaining pathetic suburban existence to successfully shave exactly 5 miserable years off his incredibly massive mandatory federal prison sentence. The completely ruthless and entirely merciless federal cybercrime division immediately officially stamped an incredibly aggressive search warrant, explicitly targeting Yvonne based entirely upon his profoundly devastating and explicitly sworn criminal testimony tonight. 4 heavily armed, plainclothes corporate detectives rapidly descended upon the exceptionally rundown extended stay motel precisely at dawn. The remarkably cheap residential building stood entirely isolated along a highly polluted industrial highway, completely disconnected from any remaining suburban luxury. The aggressively determined law enforcement team swiftly approached Yvonne's heavily stained ground floor doorway, holding a fully authorized judicial search warrant securely in hand. A towering senior detective forcefully pounded his massive fist against the rotting exterior wood, completely shattering the incredibly quiet morning atmosphere today. Yvonne frantically opened the cheap metal door, wearing deeply stained sweatpants and a totally faded oversized shirt. She immediately staggered backward in absolute sheer terror, as the heavily armed detectives aggressively flooded her remarkably tiny and incredibly depressing motel room. They swiftly flashed their golden metal badges and explicitly announced their absolute legal authority to comprehensively search her entire pathetic living space. Yvonne hysterically screamed that she was entirely innocent while aggressively demanding they immediately vacate her deeply humiliating temporary sanctuary. The highly focused law enforcement officers entirely ignored her incredibly dramatic theatrical weeping and aggressively initiated their extremely thorough tactical sweep. Two diligent officers methodically flipped her cheap mattress, while a completely stoic detective vigorously rummaged through her incredibly tiny plastic suitcase sitting near the rusted bathroom sink. He aggressively unzipped the hidden internal fabric lining and completely triumphantly pulled out a heavily folded stack of extremely thick paper files. The highly experienced investigator confidently unfolded the thoroughly hidden commercial paperwork and immediately flashed a profoundly victorious smile today. He loudly confirmed the incredibly sensitive documents prominently bore my highly recognizable corporate letterhead, completely validating the devastating federal wire fraud conspiracy charges. Yvonne stood entirely frozen near the incredibly dirty glass window, violently gasping for any remaining breathable air right now, perfectly here today. The towering senior detective entirely ignored Yvonne's profoundly desperate wailing as he aggressively pinned her trembling arms securely behind her back. Cold, heavy steel handcuffs instantly ratcheted tight around her fragile wrists, definitively marking the absolute unceremonious conclusion of her incredibly pathetic criminal charade. The heavily armed officers forcefully marched the completely broken woman directly out of her incredibly filthy motel room and pushed her completely outside into the exceptionally harsh morning sunlight today. A massively curious crowd of transient onlookers quickly gathered around the aggressively flashing police cruisers to actively record her profoundly disgraceful final exit right here. Yvonne desperately ducked her incredibly messy head, attempting to successfully hide her intensely shameful weeping from the incredibly ruthless smartphone cameras filming her total absolute destruction. She completely sacrificed her incredibly beautiful and entirely faithful suburban marriage simply to greedily chase an utterly fraudulent romantic illusion completely built entirely upon massive toxic financial deception. Her wildly arrogant attempt to utterly destroy my unshakable corporate legacy and forcefully steal my perfectly secured millions brilliantly completely backfired against her own incredibly selfish existence. The exceptionally aggressive federal prosecutors utilized her former lover's devastating testimony to swiftly formally secure an absolute mandatory maximum criminal conviction without any available judicial mercy. She incredibly rapidly completely realized she was actively facing exactly 5 incredibly miserable long years securely locked inside a deeply terrifying maximum security federal penitentiary facility for executing incredibly severe corporate espionage. She beautifully and entirely single-handedly engineered her own permanently, utterly complete, pathetic social and absolute total financial demise right here today, completely forever. She was aggressively shoved directly into the incredibly tight back seat of the cold, marked police cruiser, perfectly, completely leaving my incredibly brilliant and totally victorious, pristine logistics empire entirely, perfectly, absolutely untouched, forever, today, right here, completely. The deafening silence of my expansive master bedroom was violently shattered by the sharp ringing of my private cellular phone at exactly 2 a.m. I slowly opened my eyes and stared at the bright digital screen illuminating the absolute pitch-black room. The official caller identification explicitly displayed the county detention center. I calmly sat up and leaned against the heavy mahogany headboard, completely undisturbed by the late hour. I firmly pressed the green button and accepted the incoming automated collect call. A highly mechanical, robotic voice formally announced an incredibly urgent communication from an active inmate currently locked inside the maximum security holding facility. I methodically authorized the immediate connection and waited patiently for the inevitable disaster to completely unfold. A profoundly exhausted police desk sergeant loudly cleared his throat and verified my legal identity before delivering the incredibly predictable news. He explicitly stated that Devin was violently forcefully arrested just an hour ago following an exceptionally destructive high-speed collision. He loudly explained my heavily intoxicated son completely lost control of his expensive imported sports car and aggressively smashed directly into a massive historic municipal fountain perfectly situated in the downtown plaza. The completely shattered vehicle explicitly triggered an absolute massive emergency response, completely shutting down the entire commercial district. The stern sergeant formally confirmed Devin was currently facing incredibly severe felony charges, strictly regarding extremely reckless driving under the profound influence of heavy narcotics and actively destroying heavily protected municipal property. The incredibly aggressive suburban entitlement my son proudly weaponized for decades finally violently crashed into absolute unyielding reality tonight. I remained completely silent while the frustrated officer efficiently processed the incredibly dense legal paperwork completely securing Devin inside a remarkably cold concrete holding cell right here and right now today without any issue whatsoever. The gruff police sergeant officially transferred the active connection directly to the heavily monitored inmate telephone mounted completely flush against the dirty cinder block wall. Devin immediately grasped the heavy plastic receiver and instantly unleashed a completely hysterical torrent of incredibly pathetic sobbing directly into my ear. He loudly gasped for any breathable air while violently hyperventilating inside the exceptionally cold and incredibly terrifying holding environment. He desperately cried that his completely ruined imported vehicle was entirely impounded and absolutely crushed beyond any recognizable physical repair. He aggressively pleaded with me to immediately contact my highly expensive corporate defense team to swiftly erase this massive public humiliation. He wildly promised he would absolutely completely reform his totally toxic lifestyle and permanently abandon his incredibly destructive entitlement if I generously rescued him right here tonight. He frantically begged me to instantly wire exactly $10,000 to the authorized county bail bondsman perfectly located directly across the busy street from the dark precinct. He aggressively claimed the incredibly harsh concrete floor and totally terrifying criminal inmates immediately surrounding him were severely damaging his deeply fragile mental health. He loudly swore absolute, unwavering, eternal loyalty to my vast commercial logistics empire, completely promising to strictly obey every single professional command I ever issued. He desperately utilized the exact same incredibly manipulative childhood tactics he successfully weaponized against his deeply foolish mother for absolutely decades. He violently cried that he entirely understood the massive error of his exceptionally arrogant ways and desperately needed his strong father to provide one absolute final miraculous financial salvation. He practically choked on his own incredibly thick tears, entirely convinced his exceptionally dramatic theatrical performance would immediately unlock my massively protected corporate bank accounts completely effortlessly and perfectly right here, exactly directly tonight without any hesitation or delay whatsoever. I firmly held the incredibly sleek cellular device perfectly still against my ear while actively absorbing every single frantic syllable completely pouring from his deeply desperate mouth. I methodically listened to the exceptionally raw terror violently shaking his completely broken voice without displaying a single ounce of emotional reaction. I absolutely refused to offer him even a microscopic fraction of the incredibly warm paternal comfort he so aggressively and pathetically demanded right now. My perfectly stone-cold silence loudly echoed across the incredibly active and deeply hostile federal detention line. Devin violently paused his incredibly pathetic weeping, entirely waiting for my highly anticipated verbal validation and completely expected financial rescue. He desperately held his wildly erratic breath, entirely anticipating the familiar, incredibly soft reassurance I severely foolishly provided throughout his entirely coddled existence. I forcefully gripped the incredibly smooth edge of my heavy wooden nightstand, entirely solidifying my absolutely unyielding emotional resolve. I explicitly recognized that actively rescuing him from this completely authentic legal disaster would only permanently validate his exceptionally toxic and completely uncontrollable arrogance forever. I slowly and methodically pulled the cellular device completely away from my face absolutely ignoring his incredibly loud, desperate screams, actively begging me to please stay securely on the busy line. I completely decisively pressed the bright red digital button, entirely instantly terminating the incredibly pathetic collect communication forever. I violently severed the highly manipulative emotional connection, perfectly leaving my absolutely incredibly arrogant son entirely trapped inside the remarkably hostile concrete holding cell, completely and totally alone. I calmly placed the silent telephone face down on the polished wooden surface and methodically pulled the heavy, incredibly warm silk blanket entirely back over my resting shoulders. I closed my absolutely perfectly calm eyes and peacefully drifted directly back into deep, incredibly restful, uninterrupted sleep. The brilliant morning sunlight aggressively poured through my massive bedroom windows, perfectly signaling the absolute beginning of a completely new and entirely uncompromising operational day. I calmly finished my incredibly dark coffee and decisively dispatched my most exceptionally ruthless corporate defense attorney directly to the crowded downtown police precinct. I explicitly ordered my highly experienced legal representative to absolutely avoid securing any form of financial release for my totally terrified son today. The fiercely talented lawyer methodically approached the incredibly stern presiding municipal judge and actively agreed with the extremely heavy prosecutorial recommendations. He brilliantly ensured the highly frustrated magistrate formally denied any available monetary bail option for the remarkably reckless individual standing before him. The highly respected judge stared directly down at Devon, standing entirely shamefully in his heavily stained orange detention uniform. The exceptionally unyielding magistrate officially mandated exactly 6 grueling continuous months of incredibly hard physical community service permanently attached directly to his massive residential probation. The strict legal ruling explicitly dictated he must actively physically scrub deeply filthy city streets and entirely manually rebuild the exact same massive historic fountain he aggressively and selfishly destroyed. Devon stood entirely frozen behind the incredibly cold steel defendant podium, perfectly shaking with absolute extreme terror. He suddenly explicitly realized he must finally pay for his massive, uncontrollable actions using incredibly painful and completely real physical sweat. My brilliant corporate attorney confidently buttoned his tailored jacket and proudly watched the heavily armed bailiff aggressively march Devon directly back into the incredibly dark municipal holding cell. I methodically constructed a completely inescapable reality where absolute accountability permanently reigned supreme. The incredibly destructive era of unearned luxury was entirely eradicated and completely replaced by an exceptionally harsh lesson in completely authentic survival, perfectly executed directly right here today, without any exceptions whatsoever. The bright fluorescent lights illuminating the sprawling grocery store parking lot flickered slightly against the rapidly darkening evening sky. I methodically pushed my metal shopping cart toward my parked vehicle, enjoying the incredibly peaceful solitude following my exceptionally long corporate workday. A sudden aggressive screech of expensive rubber tires violently shattered the calm atmosphere right behind my back. Courtney aggressively slammed her sleek luxury sedan into the empty parking space directly adjacent to my passenger door, perfectly blocking my exit. She aggressively threw her car door open and furiously stomped across the asphalt, moving with absolute unhinged determination. Her fiercely manicured hand tightly gripped the tiny, fragile wrist of my innocent 5-year-old grandson. She ruthlessly dragged the completely terrified child behind her, utilizing his remarkably small body as a highly calculated human shield to initiate her malicious ambush. The poor boy stumbled awkwardly over the rough pavement, completely overwhelmed by his mother's incredibly toxic and remarkably erratic physical momentum today. Courtney entirely ignored his quiet whimpers and marched directly into my immediate personal space, entirely blocking my access to my vehicle. She aggressively positioned the frightened child directly between us, explicitly wielding his absolute innocence as an exceptionally heavy emotional weapon right here tonight. Her eyes burned with a deeply frantic and totally unrestrained greed, entirely desperate to successfully execute a highly orchestrated financial extortion against my unyielding operational walls. She confidently believed my deep paternal affection for the deeply confused boy standing before me would instantly shatter my incredibly stoic demeanor entirely perfectly. I completely maintained my absolutely unshakable composure, calmly staring directly past her intensely hostile glare, while completely analyzing her remarkably pathetic tactical positioning right now, and fully preparing my absolute ruthless corporate defense, completely flawlessly executing absolute tactical supremacy, permanently guaranteed entirely without exception. Courtney immediately unleashed a completely vicious barrage of entirely unhinged financial demands directly into my stoic face. She loudly demanded an absolute mandatory cash payment of exactly $5,000 every single month. She explicitly ordered me to silently deposit the massive exorbitant sum completely directly into her private checking account without asking a single operational question. She aggressively framed this exceptionally toxic extortion as a highly necessary continuous penalty for entirely destroying her perfectly fabricated suburban luxury. She furiously screamed that her entirely innocent child required absolute continuous financial maintenance strictly funded by my massively protected corporate empire today. She violently threatened to forcefully uproot the entirely terrified young boy and permanently move thousands of miles away to another entirely distant state immediately. She aggressively promised to ruthlessly legally block both me and my deeply broken son Devon from ever completely seeing the incredibly innocent child ever again. She maliciously weaponized the highly complicated family court system, actively threatening to completely vanish into absolute total obscurity if her exceptionally greedy demands were not perfectly met tonight. Her shrill, piercing voice echoed aggressively across the entirely empty concrete parking lot, totally projecting her absolute profound desperation. She tightly gripped the entirely sobbing boy even harder, entirely, utilizing his intense visible pain to successfully amplify her remarkably pathetic criminal coercion. She proudly stood there completely convinced she possessed absolute total operational leverage over my entire heavily protected commercial legacy right here and right now. She incorrectly believed my incredibly immense wealth entirely belonged completely to her incredibly deeply selfish financial desires, simply because she successfully produced a highly valuable legal heir entirely perfectly and without any exception whatsoever. Tonight, while completely executing her extremely pathetic, incredibly massive, entirely unearned, absolute total financial extortion plot against my permanent, unshakable family legacy forever, I remained entirely silent while deliberately resting my heavy leather briefcase directly onto the hood of my parked luxury vehicle. I methodically unclasped the incredibly solid brass locks and calmly opened the perfectly organized internal compartment, completely ignoring her highly toxic screaming. I slowly reached inside and forcefully extracted a remarkably thick manila dossier completely compiled by my absolutely elite private investigator over the past several months. I confidently handed the heavily weighted legal file directly to Courtney, entirely forcing her to physically accept the incredibly damning documentation right here in the cold parking lot. She snatchingly grabbed the extremely dense folder and aggressively flipped it completely open with remarkably frantic and totally furious hands today. The absolute terror instantly flooded her deeply arrogant eyes as she completely processed the incredibly lethal contents actively hiding inside the massive official report. The highly detailed file contained absolutely undeniable photographic proof, explicitly documenting her incredibly numerous and entirely completely reckless extramarital affairs spanning several long years. The exceptionally thorough private investigator successfully captured absolutely pristine high-definition images, perfectly showcasing her intimately entering completely cheap motels with extremely random, dangerous strangers. The completely flawless corporate dossier also actively included highly secured internal bank records, explicitly proving she maliciously and systematically embezzled exactly $90,000 directly from Devon's dedicated college savings accounts. She aggressively utilized those highly restricted educational funds entirely to secretly finance her completely illicit romantic encounters and massively expensive designer shopping habits. The incredibly meticulous financial tracing explicitly mapped every single unauthorized wire transfer completely straight into her heavily hidden secret personal accounts, perfectly destroying her entire maternal credibility. She stood completely paralyzed, staring blindly at the absolutely undeniable physical evidence, successfully, completely obliterating her incredibly fake and utterly fraudulent suburban saint persona, completely, instantly, entirely, forever today, perfectly. I leaned forward and spoke with an incredibly cold and absolutely lethal corporate precision, completely piercing the heavy night air. I explicitly promised to personally hand this entirely devastating dossier directly to the exceedingly strict family court judge absolutely first thing tomorrow morning. I flawlessly assured her this massive, unyielding mountain of perfectly irrefutable legal evidence would instantly guarantee Devon explicitly wins absolute total full custody of my entirely innocent grandson without a single remaining legal obstacle. I firmly stated she was aggressively facing exceptionally severe felony embezzlement charges regarding the completely stolen and utterly misused restricted educational funds. I coldly offered her exactly one incredibly unmerited single chance to immediately disappear completely from my deeply protected family entirely forever. I strictly ordered her to instantly abandon her completely pathetic and massively ridiculous $5,000 financial extortion completely right here today. Courtney violently turned absolutely paper pale as the incredibly immense and entirely inescapable weight of absolute total destruction fully crashed completely down upon her incredibly weak shoulders. Her fiercely arrogant breathing instantly transformed into a deeply shallow, completely terrified, frantic panting right now. She nervously dropped my exceptionally young grandson's fragile hand, completely, instantly, entirely forgetting her deeply fabricated, utterly toxic maternal devotion. She completely dropped all her exceptionally malicious financial demands completely silently, without uttering a single remaining solitary word of pathetic defense. She wildly shoved the massive thick dossier directly back into my unyielding hands, completely turning around and violently sprinting directly toward her excessively expensive imported luxury sedan in absolute sheer unadulterated terror. The incredibly heavy and exceptionally satisfying sound of her fiercely screeching tires loudly echoed across the completely empty concrete parking lot tonight. I beautifully, methodically, entirely protected my completely unshakable and totally victorious massive corporate legacy completely, perfectly, absolutely, entirely, forever today. The devastating collapse of Yvonne and her utterly fraudulent lover Bradley triggered an absolute tidal wave of severe panic across the highest echelons of my commercial logistics empire. Several wealthy and deeply established high-level business partners suddenly realized they had backed the incredibly wrong side of my brutal divorce warfare. These arrogant executives secretly conspired with my treacherous wife to systematically absorb my highly lucrative shipping routes during my anticipated financial downfall. They greedily funneled highly confidential corporate data directly to Bradley to actively finance his illicit multi-state wire fraud operations. The shocking and highly public federal arrest of their young digital pawn completely shattered their heavily guarded commercial alliances. The exceptionally swift federal indictment permanently obliterated their clandestine conspiracy. They desperately scrambled to actively distance themselves from the highly toxic radioactive fallout rapidly consuming Yvonne today. My unyielding corporate security team successfully flagged dozens of urgent communications flooding my private executive channels. These panicked men frantically attempted to reconnect with me under the false pretense of genuine commercial camaraderie. They desperately flooded my private inbox with sweet, flattering messages, entirely ignoring their massive recent betrayal. They profoundly realized my unshakable corporate fortress survived the exceptionally heavy coordinated assault completely flawlessly. They falsely assumed I lacked the concrete digital evidence explicitly proving their incredibly dark secret involvement in the massive financial conspiracy against my company. Their sudden loyalties showcased their pathetic cowardice and total lack of genuine professional integrity. They desperately hoped to smoothly slide back into my highly profitable good graces before the Federal Cybercrime Division completely uncovered their massive illicit financial contributions to the deeply ruined fraudster. The incredibly swift absolute collapse of their deeply malicious corporate coup left them entirely completely terrified of my incredibly massive and perfectly unyielding absolute vengeance completely right now today. These incredibly desperate men aggressively instructed their private executive assistants to rapidly orchestrate highly exclusive reconciliation meetings directly with my dedicated corporate secretary. They purposefully selected incredibly expensive downtown steakhouses, renowned for executing massively luxurious corporate dinners within heavily secured private dining rooms. They confidently assumed I was an incredibly old and deeply exhausted man, entirely worn down by the exceptionally massive legal battles recently concluding my marriage. They severely underestimated my unyielding operational stamina, completely believing I desperately prioritized maintaining absolute corporate stability over actively executing righteous commercial vengeance. They wildly falsely assumed I would incredibly eagerly forgive their remarkably extensive treachery simply to smoothly preserve our historically highly profitable logistics contracts without any major disruptions. These deeply arrogant partners genuinely thought a ridiculously expensive dry-aged ribeye and a highly prized bottle of vintage wine would magically erase their massive deceit. They confidently prepared exceptionally smooth corporate presentations highlighting our exceptionally long shared commercial history, entirely hoping to aggressively manipulate my perceived emotional fatigue right now. They fundamentally failed to absolutely understand that my incredibly sharp mind permanently thrives within a completely hostile and exceptionally demanding adversarial environment. They aggressively miscalculated my exceptionally deep commitment to absolutely totally purging every single toxic element entirely hiding inside my highly secured commercial empire forever today. They sat comfortably inside the beautifully decorated upscale dining establishments, confidently waiting for my highly anticipated arrival, completely anticipating a beautifully peaceful and exceptionally easy corporate surrender. They smiled incredibly warmly and excitedly adjusted their incredibly expensive silk ties, entirely expecting me to immediately warmly shake their treacherous hands without demanding absolutely any real strict accountability whatsoever. They completely blindly believed their exceptionally massive wealth incredibly shielded them from facing any severe destructive consequences, absolutely, perfectly, permanently, completely today, right now, successfully, completely, forever guaranteed. I purposefully attended every single requested reconciliation meeting solely to aggressively reject their incredibly pathetic commercial apologies directly face to face. I confidently strode into the magnificently illuminated private dining rooms wearing perfectly tailored executive suits, entirely projecting absolute total dominance. They incredibly eagerly stood up to warmly welcome me while offering ridiculously expensive alcoholic beverages, perfectly designed to smoothly grease the upcoming negotiation. I completely ignored their outstretched hands and absolutely refused to sit down at the remarkably lavish mahogany table today. I stood tall and immediately unleashed an incredibly cold and absolutely surgical precision to completely definitively dismantle their heavily fabricated business proposals right now. I explicitly dropped a highly detailed digital spreadsheet directly onto their extremely expensive pristine white tablecloth, completely unmasking their massive deceit. I loudly and methodically recited every single hidden financial transaction they illegally executed alongside my completely treacherous former wife. I explicitly proved I deeply and perfectly knew absolutely exactly how they maliciously attempted to heavily betray my highly protected operational trust during the chaotic corporate divorce. I aggressively confronted them regarding the massively compromised vendor contracts they actively tried to quickly funnel toward Bradley just a few short months ago. They instantly completely froze, entirely terrified by the absolute stunning depth of my incredibly massive comprehensive internal investigation, permanently destroying their leverage. They violently choked on their excessively expensive wine as my entirely unyielding facts completely shattered their deeply arrogant corporate shields forever. Their incredibly weak faces instantly turned absolutely paper pale, entirely realizing my complete lack of any genuine judicial mercy or emotional fatigue right here. I coldly and fiercely stared directly into their massively panicked eyes, explicitly demanding total, immediate, absolute compliance with my remarkably unshakable, completely devastating, absolutely perfect, incredibly brilliant tactical termination, perfectly executed forever right here today. I immediately executed the absolute final phase of my entirely flawless corporate restructuring by completely severing all remaining commercial ties with their incredibly corrupt network today. I forcefully canceled absolutely every single highly lucrative vendor contract permanently attached to their deeply tainted and remarkably bloated operations. I methodically transferred these exceptionally massive and entirely highly profitable shipping routes directly to a remarkably young and exceptionally aggressive logistics firm. This incredibly fast-rising enterprise was entirely owned and actively operated by a remarkably ambitious and deeply hungry entrepreneur whom I personally mentored for several continuous years. This brilliant young leader eagerly accepted the incredibly massive operational responsibility, displaying the exact fierce loyalty my foolish former partners completely lacked. The incredibly swift, unyielding transfer of immense corporate wealth successfully destroyed their previously untouchable market dominance perfectly right here tonight. They desperately attempted to legally block my massive financial maneuver completely, discovering my flawless legal team had already perfectly, securely, permanently locked down absolutely every single contractual loophole. The devastating loss of my exceptionally massive logistics business entirely triggered widespread absolute financial ruin across their deeply aging, extremely complacent commercial organizations permanently right now. I proudly watch the very final pathetic remnants of the highly toxic old guard get permanently purged from my magnificent, unstoppable corporate empire completely, successfully, forever, absolutely, entirely today. My exceptionally clean, incredibly unyielding, exceptionally brilliant total logistics victory stands completely, permanently secured today. Absolutely, completely, entirely, forever. Right here, perfectly, securely, absolutely. Finally, now, entirely, flawlessly, completely, perfectly, forever, absolutely, securely, permanently, perfectly, forever, completely. They aggressively, rapidly realized they entirely, completely, vastly miscalculated my exceptionally profound power forever today. I meticulously, successfully, systematically eradicated absolutely every single remaining piece of their deeply, utterly toxic influence entirely right here, right now, permanently, forever, successfully, perfectly today, exactly now. Exactly 6 grueling months passed since the devastating municipal gavel violently shattered Devon's completely fabricated suburban reality forever. The incredibly intense, sweltering summer heat actively baked the massive metal roof of my primary commercial logistics warehouse today. I stood entirely alone deep inside the exceptionally noisy industrial staging sector, meticulously inspecting a highly anticipated newly delivered line of massive industrial cooling units. The incredibly complex steel machinery represented an absolutely massive, multi-million-dollar corporate investment perfectly designed to completely revolutionize our entire temperature-controlled freight division. I methodically ran my heavy gloved hand directly across the pristine galvanized metal, completely analyzing the exceptionally tight engineering tolerances required for absolute operational perfection. The deafening hum of exceptionally heavy diesel engines outside perfectly masked the incredibly intense surrounding ambient warehouse noise. My highly trained eyes critically scanned the intricate digital diagnostic monitors, actively verifying the incredibly precise cooling metrics perfectly mandated by our exceptionally demanding pharmaceutical clients. I completely immersed my entire focused mind deep into the incredibly rigorous operational details, actively guaranteeing my unshakable logistics empire permanently maintained its absolute flawless market dominance. The incredibly heavy and totally unmistakable sound of exceptionally slow dragging footsteps suddenly echoed sharply against the incredibly dirty concrete floor directly behind my immediate position. The highly irregular walking rhythm completely violated the incredibly strict, fast-paced operational cadence I explicitly demanded from absolutely every single active warehouse employee right now. I instinctively tightened my solid grip directly on the heavy metal clipboard, completely preparing to aggressively reprimand an exceptionally lazy dock worker for blatantly violating my incredibly strict commercial productivity standards today. I methodically turned my entire body completely around to directly confront the highly disruptive intruder, violently breaking my perfectly orchestrated industrial silence completely perfectly right here and right now, absolutely forever, exactly today. Devon stood completely motionless directly beneath the incredibly bright industrial halogen lights actively illuminating the busy staging corridor today. He looked exceptionally exhausted and dramatically thinner than the highly arrogant man who furiously screamed at me exactly 6 months prior. His deeply tanned skin actively displayed the incredibly harsh, permanent physical results of working outside under the absolute unrelenting summer sun. He had successfully, completely finished his exceptionally grueling court-ordered municipal community service entirely flawlessly without missing a single required hour. His incredibly soft hands were now completely covered in incredibly thick, painful calluses, directly earned by physically scrubbing completely filthy city streets and entirely manually rebuilding that highly destroyed historic public fountain. He was presently wearing remarkably cheap, remarkably scuffed steel-toed work boots and a deeply faded, terribly frayed gray cotton shirt. The incredibly expensive imported Italian leather shoes and highly tailored silk luxury suits were absolutely, completely, permanently gone forever tonight. His previously unyielding, exceptionally toxic, and incredibly loud suburban arrogance had entirely, completely evaporated into absolute thin air entirely permanently today. He physically appeared incredibly deeply humbled, completely thoroughly broken, and exceptionally profoundly grounded by the absolutely crushing, undeniable weight of his totally catastrophic personal reality. His extremely weary and remarkably sunken eyes no longer aggressively projected absolutely any deeply pathetic false entitlement whatsoever right now. He simply stood there incredibly quietly, entirely absorbing the incredibly massive, deafening industrial noise completely surrounding our intensely heavy confrontation perfectly today. The extremely deep physical exhaustion, remarkably completely radiated from absolutely every single tired muscle hiding inside his incredibly sore, entirely battered human body completely right here and right now. I stood absolutely completely still, silently observing his deeply profound and incredibly massive, entirely genuine human transformation perfectly unfolding directly in front of me, right here today. Devon absolutely did not immediately unleash a completely highly toxic barrage of incredibly ridiculous financial demands right here today. He exceptionally consciously did not frantically beg me to violently reverse the incredibly massive corporate foreclosure entirely permanently separating him from his highly fabricated suburban luxury. He completely refused to aggressively shed a single solitary theatrical tear desperately designed to rapidly extract absolutely unmerited parental sympathy tonight. He incredibly deeply understood that absolutely every single completely foolish bridge explicitly connecting him directly back to his incredibly lavish and entirely unearned past was permanently, decisively burned entirely to absolute complete ash. He slowly lifted his exceptionally tired head and stared completely directly into my incredibly stern eyes without actively projecting absolutely any lingering childish resentment whatsoever. His highly measured and incredibly exceptionally slow breathing perfectly mirrored the remarkably total permanent destruction of his incredibly pathetic, previously absolutely unstoppable arrogance right now. He opened his deeply dry, severely cracked lips and incredibly quietly asked me a single remarkably straightforward operational question today. He simply wanted to officially know if that incredibly grueling, heavily physically demanding midnight graveyard shift loading incredibly heavy commercial freight trucks was still actively, completely, absolutely available for immediate permanent hiring right here today. He did not explicitly formally request a highly lucrative, incredibly massive, and entirely unearned executive management promotion completely inside my perfectly unshakable logistics empire today. He entirely humbly actively sought an exceptionally incredibly grueling entry-level manual labor position completely perfectly, strictly, entirely guaranteeing absolute total, incredibly minimum wage compensation forever today. His remarkably genuine, extremely highly profound, incredibly massive total personal capitulation completely perfectly explicitly heavily signaled the absolute ultimate explicit triumph of incredibly harsh, completely strict, absolute authentic, undeniable reality over his previously toxic, deeply destructive, completely foolish luxury forever today. I stood absolutely motionless, silently observing my entirely transformed son right here on the highly active, deeply noisy concrete warehouse floor today. I methodically analyzed the genuine sincerity heavily radiating from his incredibly tired, sunken, exceptionally unyielding, exhausted eyes right now. He was entirely, fundamentally, and permanently changed from the absolutely unhinged, totally screaming, fully arrogant, wildly pathetic, and completely entitled child I once knew. I slowly, silently, and deliberately lifted my heavy-gloved right hand perfectly straight into the cold industrial staging corridor air right now, today. I clearly, formally, intentionally, and aggressively pointed directly toward the deeply loud, intensely massive, fully enclosed, and brightly illuminated supervisor's office securely positioned at the far edge of the vast terminal today. I stared directly into Devon's thoroughly humbled face without actively projecting any traditional paternal warmth or unearned emotional comfort whatsoever right here and right now. I incredibly calmly, strictly, explicitly, and unequivocally told him to officially march over to that exact secure location immediately today. I formally instructed him to manually and actively completely fill out an entirely standard, highly mandatory, and legally required entry-level commercial employment application directly by hand tonight. I explicitly commanded him to sit quietly on the hard plastic bench and patiently wait for a rigorous official corporate operational interview, just exactly like every single other ordinary struggling citizen desperately seeking basic financial survival today. Devin did not argue, whine, or actively attempt to desperately negotiate any special executive management treatment right here tonight. He simply offered a remarkably small, deeply genuine nod of total profound acceptance regarding his new, incredibly stark reality today. He slowly turned his heavily battered body completely around and quietly walked directly toward the busy administrative office, completely ready to finally earn his own absolute, undeniable salvation forever exactly today. The immaculate panoramic glass wall of my expansive executive office provided an absolutely flawless, elevated perspective over the massive central commercial logistics yard, entirely humming with extreme industrial precision today. I stood completely alone, perfectly absorbing the remarkably satisfying mechanical symphony actively echoing from dozens of heavy diesel transport vehicles, flawlessly executing incredibly complex departure maneuvers. The sprawling, highly lucrative corporate empire I meticulously built from absolute scratch was finally entirely secure and completely sanitized of every single toxic parasitic element absolutely forever. My remarkably ruthless financial purge had perfectly successfully eradicated absolutely every single treacherous business partner and entirely destroyed all incredibly malicious internal conspiracies without a single remaining trace left behind today. The massive global operation flowed with an incredibly beautiful, relentless efficiency, strictly governed entirely by my absolute, unyielding, singular operational control, completely flawlessly, right here today. I methodically watched my exceptionally hungry, remarkably loyal young logistics protege aggressively managing a massive, highly complicated outbound freight convoy, entirely utilizing my perfectly designed corporate infrastructure flawlessly, right now. The extremely bitter, remarkably exhausting marital warfare heavily engineered by my completely deceitful former wife and her remarkably pathetic, completely destroyed lover was entirely, absolutely, completely over, perfectly, forever, today. My incredibly sharp mind absolutely thrived within the immensely demanding, remarkably highly pressured corporate environment, completely generating massive historic profit margins, entirely effortlessly, without any toxic emotional distractions whatsoever right now. I slowly adjusted my perfectly tailored Italian silk tie and completely confidently embraced the absolutely massive, undeniable power heavily radiating throughout my entirely unbreakable commercial fortress right here completely forever. The incredibly intense, remarkably satisfying feeling of absolute, total, complete victory perfectly settled directly into my remarkably calm, highly focused executive mind, permanently bringing absolute flawless peace, explicitly guaranteeing our operational supremacy entirely, perfectly, right here, exactly, absolutely, today. The incredibly heavy, solid mahogany office door slowly opened directly behind my perfectly organized, immaculate executive desk right here today. Devin quietly and methodically stepped directly into the exceptionally expansive, climate-controlled administrative room, entirely abandoning his previously ingrained, highly explosive, dramatic entrances tonight. He was currently wearing incredibly heavily grease-stained canvas industrial overalls and a remarkably bright, heavily worn neon yellow high-visibility safety vest perfectly today. His exceptionally expensive imported Italian designer wardrobe was completely, entirely, permanently replaced by absolute basic, highly functional, completely standard commercial warehouse gear perfectly forever. He had incredibly quietly and completely diligently actively worked directly upon the physically demanding, highly punishing concrete loading docks for the exact past 3 continuous grueling weeks, completely, perfectly, without uttering a single, solitary, pathetic complaint whatsoever right now, today. His profoundly dirty, intensely exhausted physical appearance perfectly explicitly highlighted the absolutely immense, undeniable, genuine toll actively extracted by completely authentic, incredibly rigorous daily manual labor entirely today. The previously unyielding, immensely toxic arrogance, permanently previously radiating directly from his entirely ungrateful, foolish soul, was absolutely, completely, entirely, explicitly, perfectly, permanently, completely erased, absolutely, entirely, completely, forever today. He stood perfectly still, heavily breathing the crisp, cool air, completely waiting for my absolute, strict, formal, operational acknowledgement, directly right here, perfectly today. The remarkably intense, incredibly deep physical transformation perfectly explicitly communicated an absolute, total, complete, remarkably genuine internal behavioral shift, entirely, heavily, deeply, successfully, completely executed over the remarkably difficult, strictly rigorous, incredibly punishing previous active, completely standard 21 active working days, precisely, completely, perfectly, flawlessly, right here, exactly, absolutely perfectly today, exactly right, entirely now, completely perfectly, entirely right here in this beautifully massive, totally immaculate, brilliantly designed, fully secured, highly isolated executive space, completely, silently, perfectly, correctly, forever, absolutely, perfectly, completely, exactly today. Devon slowly approached my incredibly massive solid mahogany desk, explicitly carrying a heavily utilized aluminum inventory clipboard perfectly gripped inside his extensively calloused, exceptionally dirty hands today. He remarkably gently placed the incredibly highly detailed daily commercial shipping manifest directly onto the polished wooden surface, completely actively avoiding making absolutely any unnecessary sudden mechanical noises entirely right now. He immediately took exactly 2 incredibly precise, highly respectful steps, perfectly straight backwards, entirely maintaining a strictly rigid operational posture, completely actively waiting for my explicit verbal instruction directly right here today. I remained completely seated, actively, silently evaluating the exceptionally massive, profound internal shift, completely, permanently, undeniably embedded entirely directly into my profoundly humbled son right here today. His deeply battered, unkempt physical frame completely, perfectly communicated his entirely immense, newfound, absolute respect for strict commercial, hierarchical boundaries entirely, flawlessly, right now, perfectly, forever. I methodically unlocked a hidden executive compartment and gracefully extracted a completely pristine crystal pitcher filled, perfectly, entirely, completely full with incredibly frigid, exceptionally clear, pure filtered ice water today. I exceptionally slowly poured exactly 2 identical, incredibly heavy, beautifully polished, imported flawless crystal glasses, completely, perfectly, entirely, brilliantly up to their exact, perfect, identical brims entirely today. I deliberately placed 1 fully filled, remarkably heavy glass explicitly, beautifully, profoundly, meticulously, incredibly, thoroughly, exceptionally, highly, completely, flawlessly, remarkably, solidly, intensely, perfectly, incredibly, precisely, securely, firmly, fully, absolutely, gracefully, exactly directly onto the exact center of the polished desk. I calmly slid the incredibly cold crystal vessel completely, perfectly across the incredibly wide, smooth surface, directly toward his deeply calloused, incredibly tired, heavily battered, waiting hands. He silently accepted the remarkably heavy glass, completely, perfectly acknowledging the incredible, profound weight of my extremely silent, incredibly powerful paternal gesture, perfectly right here, exactly, absolutely, completely, perfectly, forever, exactly today. We systematically consumed the exceptionally cold, pure water together in absolute, complete, incredibly profound, total silence, perfectly right here today. There was absolutely, completely no massively pathetic emotional breakdown, violently echoing entirely across the incredibly massive glass office tonight. There were entirely no incredibly theatrical, dramatic, incredibly foolish, highly manipulated, entirely fake apologies actively spilling from his totally silent lips perfectly right now. Our incredibly peaceful, deeply authentic mutual interaction, completely firmly, successfully established, and absolutely remarkably powerful, incredibly new, entirely unbreakable, incredibly solid, absolute foundation of incredibly exceptionally deep human respect right here, completely forever today. The intensely, remarkably quiet administrative room was entirely, completely, permanently no longer a deeply toxic, entirely hostile, incredibly punishing place of absolute immense familial suffering perfectly right now. It had beautifully and entirely permanently, explicitly, flawlessly transformed completely into a massively unyielding, entirely protected, strictly governed, absolutely impenetrable, perfectly unshakable, incredible, heavy, silent, pristine, perfectly secure corporate fortress of absolute, true, pure, incredible, undeniable, profound human dignity, completely, perfectly, right here, forever, today. I completely smoothly returned my perfectly polished, exceptionally clear, entirely, completely empty crystal glass directly back onto the massive, solid mahogany desk. Perfectly flawlessly right now. Devon incredibly quietly, respectfully, perfectly accurately, efficiently, entirely mirrored my extremely precise, highly controlled physical movement, entirely successfully, perfectly correctly, completely, beautifully, carefully, firmly, strongly, resolutely, totally safely, entirely, directly, correctly, completely, right, flawlessly today. He perfectly nodded his completely humbled, absolutely, completely exhausted, incredibly dirty, completely, heavily, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, deeply, profoundly head, and entirely safely, properly, completely quietly, absolutely respectfully, carefully exited the perfectly, massively, incredibly, highly, utterly, intensely, completely, entirely, precisely, brilliantly, completely, perfectly, truly, heavily, incredibly, strictly, deeply, totally, fully, strictly, officially, firmly, absolutely, completely secured, pristine executive office, entirely, absolutely, correctly, totally, completely, perfectly, flawlessly, right here, exactly today. Right? If you enjoyed this chapter of Absolute Corporate Justice, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do in Hollis's position?